Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Elliot Graves didn't believe in fate. He believed in mechanics, in precision, in the way gears clicked together and hands swept along a dial with the elegance of an artist's brush. His life, much like his work, was simple and predictable until the day he found the watch. It was tucked in the corner of a cluttered flea market, buried beneath a pile of old trinkets and forgotten relics. Elliot had no intention of shopping that day, but the market had an odd pull, an uncanny charm that made him wander deeper than he'd planned. The vendor, an old man with a weathered face and hands that looked like they'd seen too many years, beckoned him over. "Something special for you," the old man rasped. He slid a small velvet pouch across the table, a watch like no other. Elliot eyed the pouch suspiciously. Most of the items here were cheap, second-hand odds and ends, nothing worth his time. But something about the man's voice, low and insistent, intrigued him. He opened the pouch. Inside, resting on a faded red cushion, was an antique pocket watch, its brass casing tarnished and scratched with age. The face was cracked, but it still ticked steadily, though the hands appeared to be frozen at exactly 12 o'clock. The second hand didn't move. Elliot frowned, picked it up. It was heavier than he expected, cool to the touch, and when he held it closer, he felt a strange hum in the air, as if the watch was vibrating with life. It was old, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. Delicate engravings of strange symbols adorned its back, patterns he didn't recognize. "You'll want this one," the old man continued, watching him closely. "It's been waiting for you." Elliot didn't believe in destiny, but there was something about the watch that felt right. It seemed to call to him, almost as if it had been waiting for him to find it. Despite the decades it had likely been buried in the dirt. "How much?" Elliot asked, trying to hide the sudden rush of curiosity. The old man's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into something of a smile. "For you? No charge. Just make sure you wind it carefully." Elliot hesitated. The market was full of charlatans, all eager to sell you something you didn't need. But there was something about the old man's voice that convinced him. He pocketed the watch, nodding his thanks before walking away, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Back in his small workshop, Elliot set the watch on his workbench. The room smelled of old wood, oil, and metal, a sanctuary of ticking clocks, where he could lose himself in the rhythm of time. He ran his fingers over the watch's cracked face, inspecting the intricate design. It wasn't something he'd normally fix. Too delicate, too odd, but something about it felt different. He turned the crown and tried to wind it, but nothing happened. No click, no movement, just silence. Shrugging, he placed the watch down and began working on a nearby clock, letting his mind wander. Time was something he understood well. It was a constant, an unyielding force, predictable and unbreakable. But then, as the clock in the corner of the room struck midnight, something strange happened. Elliot looked up at the watch on his workbench. The hands were moving. It was subtle at first, just a fraction of an inch, but it was there. The second hand flicked forward, then stopped. The minute hand ticked forward too, a single deliberate motion. He blinked and stood up, leaning closer. This was impossible. The watch had been stuck at 12 o'clock when he first found it. Now it was moving on its own, as if it had never stopped. Fascinated, he reached down, winding the crown again. This time, the watch began to tick steadily. The second hand moved, almost imperceptibly at first, and then faster, tick, 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 as if it was catching up on lost time. Elliot stared at it, his mind racing. The gears inside were clicking into place, and he felt something else, something more, as if the very air around him had shifted. He glanced at the clocks around him. They were still, unmoving. The world had frozen, but for some reason, this watch was alive. He pressed his thumb on the crown again, and time stopped. The entire room held its breath. Elliot let out a slow exhale, staring around the workshop. Nothing moved. Not the dust motes in the air. Not the ticking of the other clocks. Everything had ceased. Yet, somehow, he was still aware of the quiet hum of the watch in his hand. He stood there for a moment, caught between wonder and disbelief. The watch had done it. It had stopped time. It felt exhilarating. He ran his fingers through his hair, grinning. This was impossible. This was unnatural. And yet, it was real. Elliot slowly took a step forward, looking around the frozen room. He moved toward the window. Outside, the world was still. Not a car, not a pedestrian. The sky was locked in an eternal dusk. Everything had stopped, frozen in place. But there was something odd, too. Something unsettling. It wasn't just the stillness. It was the weight. The sense that there was something else in the room with him, watching him though nothing had moved. The feeling passed quickly, but the chill that crept along his spine remained. Elliot glanced down at the watch in his hand. The second hand moved again just a little, and everything shifted back into place. He gasped, blinking at the clock. It had started again. A thrill surged through him. He felt in control. As the world resumed its normal rhythm, Elliot realized that he hadn't just stopped time, he had borrowed it. And that's when he heard it. A faint whisper, like a breath of wind against his ear. Don't use it too much. He spun around, but there was no one. The shop was still. The clocks were still. Time was still. He couldn't shake the feeling that the warning had come from somewhere deep inside the watch itself. But there was no time to dwell on it. Not now. Not when he had so much to test. Elliot turned the crown again. Elliot Graves didn't believe in fate. He believed in mechanics, in precision, in the way gears clicked together and hands swept along a dial with the elegance of an artist's brush. His life, much like his work, was simple and predictable until the day he found the watch. It was tucked in the corner of a cluttered flea market, buried beneath a pile of old trinkets and forgotten relics. Elliot had no intention of shopping that day, but the market had an odd pull, an uncanny charm that made him wander deeper than he'd planned. The vendor, an old man with a weathered face and hands that looked like they'd seen too many years, beckoned him over. "Something special for you," the old man rasped. He slid a small velvet pouch across the table. A watch like no other. Elliot eyed the pouch suspiciously. Most of the items here were cheap, second-hand odds and ends, nothing worth his time. But something about the man's voice, low and insistent, intrigued him. He opened the pouch. Inside, resting on a faded red cushion, was an antique pocket watch, its brass casing tarnished and scratched with age. The face was cracked, but it still ticked steadily, though the hands appeared to be frozen at exactly 12 o'clock. The second hand didn't move. Elliot frowned, picked it up. It was heavier than he expected, cool to the touch, and when he held it closer, he felt a strange hum in the air, as if the watch was vibrating with life. It was old, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. Delicate engravings of strange symbols adorned its back, patterns he didn't recognize. "You'll want this one," the old man continued, watching him closely. "It's been waiting for you." Elliot didn't believe in destiny, but there was something about the watch that felt right. It seemed to call to him, almost as if it had been waiting for him to find it, despite the decades it had likely been buried in the dirt. "How much?" Elliot asked, trying to hide the sudden rush of curiosity. The old man's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into something of a smile. "For you? No charge. Just make sure you wind it carefully." Elliot hesitated. The market was full of charlatans, all eager to sell you something you didn't need. But there was something about the old man's voice that convinced him. He pocketed the watch, nodding his thanks before walking away, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Back in his small workshop, Elliot set the watch on his workbench. The room smelled of old wood, oil, and metal, a sanctuary of ticking clocks, where he could lose himself in the rhythm of time. He ran his fingers over the watch's cracked face, inspecting the intricate design. It wasn't something he'd normally fix. Too delicate, too odd, but something about it felt different. He turned the crown and tried to wind it, but nothing happened. No click, no movement, just silence. Shrugging, he placed the watch down and began working on a nearby clock, letting his mind wander. Time was something he understood well. It was a constant, an unyielding force, predictable and unbreakable. But then, As the clock in the corner of the room struck midnight, something strange happened. Elliot looked up at the watch on his workbench. The hands were moving. It was subtle at first, just a fraction of an inch, but it was there. The second hand flicked forward, then stopped. The minute hand ticked forward too, a single deliberate motion. He blinked and stood up, leaning closer. This was impossible. The watch had been stuck at 12 o'clock when he first found it. Now it was moving on its own, as if it had never stopped. Fascinated, he reached down, winding the crown again. This time, the watch began to tick steadily. The second hand moved, almost imperceptibly at first, and then faster, tick, 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 as if it was catching up on lost time. Elliot stared at it, his mind racing. The gears inside were clicking into place, and he felt something else, something more, as if the very air around him had shifted. He glanced at the clocks around him. They were still, unmoving. The world had frozen, but for some reason, this watch was alive. He pressed his thumb on the crown again, and time stopped. The entire room held its breath. Elliot let out a slow exhale, staring around the workshop. Nothing moved, not the dust motes in the air, not the ticking of the other clocks. Everything had ceased. Yet, somehow, he was still aware of the quiet hum of the watch in his hand. He stood there for a moment, caught between wonder and disbelief. The watch had done it. It had stopped time. It felt exhilarating. He ran his fingers through his hair, grinning. This was impossible. This was unnatural. And yet it was real. Elliot slowly took a step forward, looking around the frozen room. He moved toward the window. Outside, the world was still. Not a car, not a pedestrian. The sky was locked in an eternal dusk. Everything had stopped, frozen in place. But there was something odd, too. Something unsettling. It wasn't just the stillness. It was the weight. The sense that there was something else in the room with him, watching him, though nothing had moved. The feeling passed quickly, but the chill that crept along his spine remained. Elliot glanced down at the watch in his hand. The second hand moved again, just a little, and everything shifted back into place. He gasped, blinking at the clock. It had started again. A thrill surged through him. He felt in control. As the world resumed its normal rhythm, Elliot realized that he hadn't just stopped time, he had borrowed it. And that's when he heard it. A faint whisper, like a breath of wind against his ear. Don't use it too much. He spun around, but there was no one. The shop was still. The clocks were still. Time was still. He couldn't shake the feeling that the warning had come from somewhere deep inside the watch itself. But there was no time to dwell on it. Not now. Not when he had so much to test. Elliot turned the crown again. Elliot wound the crown again, his hands trembling with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The watch responded almost immediately. The world around him froze once more. He stood still, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his chest. But this time, something felt different. He felt different. The air was heavier, thick with an unspoken tension, like something was just out of sight, waiting. He looked around the shop. The dust motes were suspended in the air, motionless. The clocks on the walls, usually so insistent in their ticking, were silent. Yet his breath was steady. He was aware. His senses were heightened, sharper than ever before. He took a cautious step forward, slowly moving toward the door. The wooden floorboards creaked under his weight, though no one would have heard it. No one could hear him. The world was his for the taking. He reached for the door handle, wondering just how far he could push this newfound power. The thought of exploring, of breaking time itself, began to consume him. What could he do if he could stop time whenever he wanted? He could do anything. He could change anything. But then he heard it again. A faint whisper, but this time it was more distinct, more urgent. Stop. Elliot froze mid-step, his fingers inches from the door handle. He turned around, scanning the room. Nothing. The whispers. They weren't coming from anyone. There were no voices, no person. It was as if the watch itself was speaking to him, warning him. He shook his head, tried to dismiss the unease creeping up his spine. The watch was just a tool, a device, and he controlled it. There was nothing supernatural about it, just mechanics, gears, and precision. There was no reason to be afraid. He reached out and opened the door. Outside, the streets were a strange, eerie stillness. The usual bustle of the city, cars honking, people chatting, dogs barking, was replaced by a vacuum of silence. Every single person, every car, every living thing had been frozen in place. A woman stood outside a cafe, holding a cup of coffee in midair. A child had dropped his ice cream cone, but the ice cream was suspended, dripping slowly onto the ground. Elliot marveled at the surreal sight. The entire world was his playground. He could do anything, take whatever he wanted, say whatever he wanted, no consequences. He smiled and walked down the street, observing the frozen world around him like it was some kind of elaborate display, a show for his own amusement. He walked past a frozen dog, its eyes wide with fear, but it couldn't move. A homeless man was caught mid-gesture, asking for change from someone who no longer existed. It was like being in a dream. Everything felt detached, unreal, as if he had been plucked from the world and placed somewhere far away where nothing mattered. But then the thought hit him. If everything was frozen, then he was alone. He was the only one moving. That feeling of being utterly, terrifyingly alone hit him like a wave. His smile faltered. He stopped in the middle of the street, looking around at the frozen figures. The woman with the coffee cup, the child with the ice cream cone, the dog, all locked in their final moments. It was a nightmare, really. Nothing was moving. Nothing was changing. He could touch them, but they wouldn't respond. It was like looking at lifeless statues, made of flesh instead of stone. Something inside him twisted. The realization that, despite his control, he was completely isolated in this frozen world gnawed at him. He turned back toward the shop, feeling the weight of the watch in his pocket. His grip tightened around it, almost as if he were trying to control it again, to make it do what he wanted. But then, as he approached the shop, something strange happened. The shadows seemed off. There was a darkness creeping along the edges of his vision. It wasn't a physical thing. It was just there, pulling at his consciousness, tugging him toward the edges of reality. He shook his head and pushed the door open again, stepping back into the workshop. The world immediately resumed. The clocks started ticking again. The dust motes began drifting lazily in the air, and the hum of life returned to the room. But something was wrong. Elliot's heart began to race as he looked around. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't turned the crown. Time should have resumed at a normal pace, but it was off. The world was subtly different. The workbench in front of him was slightly askew, as though someone had moved it while he was outside. A single clock on the wall was 5 minutes ahead of the others, its hands moving too quickly. He reached for it, touching the glass. It was warm, too warm, as if it had been running faster than it should have been. And then he noticed it. A shadow, faint at first, shifting behind the pile of clocks. It moved without sound, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. Something or someone was standing just out of sight. His blood ran cold. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, only the soft tick-tick-tick of the clocks around him. Then he heard it. The whisper again, but this time was louder, closer. "You shouldn't have done that." Elliot spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one. Nothing. The room was the same. Everything was still, except for the watch. It was ticking faster now, faster than it had been. A sense of dread washed over him as he realized the consequences of what he had done. The watch wasn't just a tool, it was a gateway, an object that shifted the very nature of time itself. The more he used it, the more reality seemed to bend. And with that, something was following him. The shadows had started to move. Elliot's heart thudded loudly in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. The workshop felt smaller, more suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on him. The shadow he had seen behind the pile of clocks was no longer just a flicker at the corner of his eye. It was real, solid, and unmistakable. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any trace of a figure. But there was nothing, just the watch on the workbench, ticking away, and the ever-present hum of the clocks. And then, just as he was about to dismiss it as a trick of his mind, the air shifted. A cold gust of wind whispered through the room. Impossible, given the closed windows and the lack of breeze. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, as though they were reaching toward him. He glanced down at the watch again. The second hand was moving faster now, jerking in quick, uneven ticks, almost as if it was malfunctioning. It was a chaotic rhythm, one that felt wrong, out of sync with the world around him. He was certain now the watch wasn't just warping time, it was warping everything. A sharp, scraping sound cut through the silence, like something scraping against the wood, something heavy dragging its feet. Elliot's pulse quickened, his legs trembling as he stepped backward, away from the workbench. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice wavering slightly. The shadow in the corner twitched. Slowly at first, then more deliberately, it began to take shape, forming into something humanoid. The darkness seemed to gather in one place, gathering mass, until a figure emerged from it, its features indistinct but its presence undeniably real. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, outstretched limbs that seemed to stretch further than they should. Its face was a blank void, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless mask. Elliot's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, but the air was thick with dread, suffocating him. The figure didn't move toward him. It simply stood there, watching, its head slightly tilted, its presence looming like a dark cloud. The room seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping by degrees. He could see his breath misting in the air. "You shouldn't have done that." The voice came again, low and hollow, reverberating through the space. It wasn't a voice like a human's. It was something else, something ancient, otherworldly. The words seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding him, wrapping around him like a physical force. Elliot's hands shook as he reached for the watch, but before he could touch it, the figure stepped forward, a single, long finger extending, pointing directly at him. The air thickened with an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Suddenly, the clocks around him began to chime, not the usual soft ticking, but loud, ominous bells, each one tolling as if warning him. Each sound echoed in his head, a relentless wave of noise that made his teeth ache. It was like there were no longer clocks, they were counting down to something. Elliot stumbled back, knocking over a stack of tools on the workbench. They clattered to the floor, the noise deafening in the eerie stillness of the room. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't make a sound. He could feel it now, the presence behind him, just out of his sight. There were more of them, waiting for him to do something. To use the watch again. The watch. He had to get rid of it. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, the figure's arm extended further, unnaturally long, and reached for him. The space between them was impossibly large, and yet the hand seemed to close the gap in an instant, its fingers wrapping around his wrist with a cold grip that sent ice through his veins. The figure's face remained featureless, but the pressure on his wrist intensified, and with it, a searing pain shot through his arm. The room spun, and Elliot fell to his knees, gasping. The figure leaned closer, and the voice whispered in his ear, "You can't escape it. It's already too late." The shadow's grip tightened, pulling him toward it. Elliot tried to resist, to pull away, but it was useless. The figure had no substance, no form. It was like trying to fight against smoke or fog. It was everywhere. His hand moved to the pocket where the watch was tucked. He needed it. He needed to stop time again to escape this. But when his fingers brushed against it, the watch felt cold. Colder than it had ever been. It was wrong. And then, as if on cue, everything shifted. The workshop around him twisted, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The walls rippled like liquid, the shelves and workbenches distorting, melting into the space itself. A sudden, sharp pressure gripped his chest, as if something were trying to squeeze the very air from his lungs. The shadow loomed over him, its presence swallowing the light in the room. "You are not in control anymore." The voice was everywhere, and yet nowhere. It was as if time itself had turned against him, bending the reality of the room to its will. The air snapped back to silence. The figure, still holding his wrist, dragged him backward towards the center of the room. The darkness around them thickened until there was no room left, just a void where Elliot's world once was. The watch, the one thing he thought could save him, now felt like a burden. The second hand jerked and stuttered, as if it was no longer in tune with the rhythm of the universe. The darkness was closing in, and in that moment, Elliot understood. Time wasn't just something you could control. Time wasn't a gift, it was a curse. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as the figure's grip tightened around his wrist, pulling him deeper into the void. He fought with every ounce of his strength, but it was useless. His body felt heavy, sluggish, like the air itself had become thick with resistance. The shadow enveloped him, pressing in from all sides, suffocating the very light in the room. The watch in his pocket felt like an anchor, a weight that dragged him further into the abyss. With trembling hands, he pulled it out, holding it before him as if it might somehow ward off the darkness. But as he gazed down at it, something in his gut twisted with dread. The second hand was still jerking erratically, and the minute hand had spun off-center, dancing in chaotic circles. The watch no longer seemed to tick. It was stopping time. But that wasn't possible. It wasn't supposed to stop time entirely. It was supposed to freeze everything around him, give him control, make him master of it all. Instead, the watch was betraying him, unraveling the very fabric of reality. The darkness around him thickened, pressing harder, squeezing his chest, and for a fleeting moment, he felt as though he was going to suffocate. The shadow had released its grip on his wrist, but it was now surrounding him entirely, its presence overwhelming, its form ever-shifting, as if it had no true shape at all. The voice came again, whispering, no longer in his ear, but directly in his mind. "You have taken too much. You have bent time beyond its limits." Elliot's throat tightened, his mind racing. What had he done? He'd been reckless, playing with forces he couldn't comprehend. The whispers weren't just warnings, they were a promise of something worse. A deep rumble reverberated in his bones, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. The walls, the shelves, the clocks, they all began to blur, fading in and out of focus like an old film reel skipping frames. Time itself was warping, like an elastic band stretched too far, too fast, until it was about to snap. Elliot clenched the watch tighter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know what to do. He was trapped, stuck between moments, his existence caught in the jagged edges of time. He glanced at the shadow once more, its figure now impossibly large, towering above him like an endless chasm of darkness. "You cannot control time," the voice intoned, low and heavy with inevitability. "It controls you, and you have broken the covenant. Now, you will pay the price." Elliot felt a sharp, cold wave of panic. He had to fix this. He had to undo it. With trembling hands, he raised the watch to his face, his fingers fumbling with the crown. He tried to wind it anything, but the watch felt like it was slipping through his fingers as if it were made of smoke. The second hand was a blur now, spinning uncontrollably. The symbols on the back of the casing seemed to twist and writhe, like living things pulling at his vision, twisting his perception. And then, just as the room seemed to fracture, the darkness closing in on him from all sides, a sharp, unmistakable click echoed in the air. The watch stopped. Everything went silent. For a brief moment, the world held its breath. The shadows stopped shifting. The air seemed to pause, hanging on the cusp of something that felt wrong. And then a soft hum, like a breath drawn in too deeply, began to resonate through the space. Elliot's vision blurred. His hands felt numb. The room began to fold in on itself, like a crumpled piece of paper. The workshop he'd once known, his sanctuary, his world, was disintegrating before him. Time was no longer a simple measurement of seconds and minutes. It was a living, breathing thing that was now consuming him. The shadow loomed closer, its featureless face somehow growing clearer, more tangible. Elliot's throat tightened, and his breath caught in his chest. The figure's hands reached out, its long, elongated fingers brushing against his face, cold and distant. Time cannot be cheated. It said again, its voice now a deep, resonant echo, vibrating through his very bones. And now you will see what happens when time is no longer bound by its limits. Elliot's vision went black, the shadows swallowing him whole. and for a moment, there was nothing but emptiness. When Elliot opened his eyes, he wasn't in the workshop anymore. He was standing in the middle of a vast, endless void. No walls, no clocks, no furniture, just darkness stretching in every direction, an infinite expanse of nothingness. He blinked, disoriented, his body feeling oddly light, as though gravity no longer applied to him. The air was thick with silence, oppressive and unnatural. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the watch in his hand. He looked down at it, heart sinking. The second hand was still, stuck, stubbornly frozen. But the watch was alive in his hand. It pulsed with a quiet hum, as if it were trying to tell him something. It was waiting. He could feel the weight of the watch now, heavier than ever before. It was not a tool to control time, as he had thought. It was something else, something far more ancient, far more dangerous. And then the whisper came again. "You're lost in time now. You will never escape." Elliot's throat tightened as the realization hit him. The shadow had been right. He had broken time. He had become a part of it, woven into its very fabric. There was no going back. He had crossed the line, and now he was trapped in the place where time itself could no longer reach him. The endless void stretched out before him, and with it, the haunting truth. Time was no longer something he could control. Time had consumed him. He had become nothing more than a moment, lost to the ever-ticking hands of the watch. Elliot's breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of his situation settled over him. The watch in his hand pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, its second hand now immobile, locked in place like a frozen heartbeat. In this boundless, empty space, the ticking was the only sound, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. He looked around, trying to grasp something, anything, to give him an understanding of what was happening, but there was nothing. No horizon, no light, no form to orient himself by. It was as if he had been cast into a dimension where time didn't exist, or perhaps where time was everything. The whisper echoed through the void again, as if it were coming from every direction at once. "You have become part of time's weave, an echo lost in its endless loops. The watch has bound you here and now. You are one with it." Elliot's chest tightened, a wave of dread crashing over him. He wanted to scream, to shout, but the silence pressed in so heavily. He felt like his voice would disappear before it even left his lips. Time was no longer his enemy. It had become his companion, a constant, suffocating presence. The idea of being forever tangled in this non-space, this fractured moment, was enough to make his mind spiral. No, I need to fix this, he thought desperately, his fingers tightening around the watch. He couldn't be stuck like this forever. He had to undo it, had to find a way out. There had to be something, some way to escape the endless cycle. He thought back to the workshop, to the feeling of power he had had when he first won the crown, when the world had bent to his will. But this was different. This was no longer about control. It was about survival. With trembling hands, he fiddled with the watch, desperate to find any way to make it work again, to wind it, to manipulate it. But the crown refused to turn. It was as if the watch had become a part of the fabric of this place, its mechanism locked in the void itself, refusing to obey. A sense of hopelessness began to creep over him. He had already used the watch to its limits, and now it was using him. The realization felt like an anchor dragging him deeper into the endless abyss. The fabric of time, which he had once thought of as something to be controlled, had instead swallowed him whole, and he was lost in its grasp. "You cannot escape." The whisper came again, closer now, as though the voice was breathing down his neck. Elliot spun around, his eyes wide, searching for the source of the voice. But the darkness offered no answers. It was all-consuming. His heart pounded in his chest, his legs weak beneath him. "Time is a thread," the voice continued, sounding almost amused. "A thread you have pulled until it unraveled. And now, there is no return. You are an echo, a ripple in the stream, a moment suspended forever, unbound by the laws you once knew." The world felt as though it was shifting beneath his feet, rippling like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. Elliot staggered back, panic rising in his chest. He needed to break free. He needed to fix it, but there was no escape. For what felt like an eternity, the void around him remained unchanged, its silence overwhelming, suffocating. Time was both non-existent and all-encompassing. His thoughts swirled together, visions of the workshop, the city, the faces of the people he had walked past without a second thought. Had they even been real? Or were they all just fragments of a world he had destroyed? He thought of the woman at the cafe, the child with the ice cream cone, the dog frozen in place. The lives that had been paused, suspended. Had he caused all of this? Had his desire for control brought everything crashing down? A sudden, sharp sound pierced the silence, like a crack in the air, a fracture in the void. It was the sound of something breaking. Elliot spun toward the noise, his heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time, and with it, the world around him began to ripple. The darkness twisted, folding in on itself, as though the very fabric of the void was being torn apart. In the center of it all, the figure appeared again, the shadow he had seen in the workshop. It was larger now, its form more solid, more menacing. Its elongated fingers reached toward him, its featureless face a blank, suffocating void. The air around it vibrated with an almost palpable tension. "It's time," the voice said, though it didn't come from the figure's mouth. It seemed to come from within Elliot's own mind, cold and hollow. Elliot stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. As it came closer, the temperature dropped even further, the chill biting into his skin. The darkness seemed to pulse around him, alive, as if the void itself was aware of his presence, aware of his fear. And then, the figure spoke again. "You cannot escape what you have set in motion. You are no longer a part of the world you knew. You are time's prisoner." The finality of the words hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no escaping. The threads of his existence had been unraveled, and now there was no repair. He had become one with the ticking, one with the very thing he had sought to control. And in the end, it was time that controlled him. The figure's hand reached toward him, its fingers stretching further, and Elliot felt his body stiffen. The darkness surrounded him, swallowing him whole. And in that final, terrifying moment, he knew he was no longer a man, no longer someone capable of change. He was just another moment lost to the endless, unyielding flow of time. And with that, the darkness closed in, erasing him from the world, a prisoner to the watch's ticking eternity. The darkness felt endless, cold, oppressive, like being submerged in the deepest part of the ocean, unable to see or hear anything but the crushing weight pressing in on him. Elliot's mind swirled in a haze, half-conscious, caught between fear and something else, a strange, undeniable emptiness. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His limbs felt heavy, as though they no longer belonged to him. His thoughts were fractured, pieces of memories scattered like broken glass on an infinite plane. He was slipping into the very fabric of time itself. And then, just as the weight of the void seemed unbearable, a soft sound broke through the silence. A faint tick. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. The watch. Elliot blinked, or at least he thought he did. His eyelids felt like lead. The tick grew louder, closer, resonating with something deep inside him. It was like a thread pulling at the edges of his consciousness, tugging him from the darkness. Was he still alive? A fragment of his former self clung to that question, desperate for an answer. The tick grew louder. With each beat, the sound reverberated through the void, shaking the silence, pushing back the darkness. Slowly, very slowly, Elliot became aware of his body again, his fingers twitching, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He wasn't completely lost. The tick was, guiding him. "I need to get out," he thought, panic beginning to claw its way through the fog in his mind. The darkness felt like it was closing in again, trying to swallow him whole, but the sound of the watch, a steady, rhythmic pulse, was anchoring him. Without fully understanding why, Elliot reached out, his fingers trembling, and for the first time since everything had begun, he focused on the watch in his hand. The second hand had been frozen before, locked in place, but now it was moving again. Slow, steady, but it was moving, and in the very center of the watch's face, something caught his eye, something he had never noticed before. A symbol. It wasn't part of the watch's original design. It was new, burned into the surface, as though it had appeared out of thin air. A spiraling shape, a labyrinth, almost like the image of an eye, its shape continuous and never-ending. It seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the ticking, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. What was it? Elliot's mind raced. The symbol felt important, no vital. It was the key, the missing piece he had to understand in order to break free. He could feel it in his gut, that unmistakable sensation of something shifting, something unlocking. And then, without warning, the symbol seemed to pull him in. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze again. The darkness, the void, the weight pressing on him. Everything was suspended in a heartbeat. The watch's ticking had stopped, but the pull was stronger than ever. I can't fight it, he realized. The pull was beyond him, beyond his control. And just like that, the darkness split, it fractured, shattering into a million tiny pieces, revealing a blinding light behind it. The light was too bright to look at directly, but it felt alive. It hummed with energy, as though it was made of pure existence. And in that light, something else appeared, something far more familiar. The workshop. It was faint at first, like an old, blurry photograph, but it slowly grew clearer, more tangible. The benches, the tools, the clocks, and there, in the center of it all, was the watch, lying on the workbench, untouched. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Had he returned? His heart raced as he reached toward the light, reaching for the watch. But as his fingers touched the edge of the workbench, a strange, electric shock ran through his body. The world around him flickered, then stopped, as if time itself had hit pause. He glanced around in confusion. The room was still, the clocks all frozen in place. But it wasn't the peace he'd expected. It was unsettling, like the world had become too still, like something was waiting. The second hand of the watch on the workbench began to move again, but this time it moved slowly, deliberately, almost too deliberately, as if it had a mind of its own. Tick, tick, tick. Elliot's stomach turned. The sound was too familiar, too invasive. It wasn't just the sound of a clock anymore. It was the sound of something more, something far more dangerous. The room around him seemed to bend, the edges of the walls warping and twisting like the world itself was collapsing in on itself. His surroundings flickered like a broken film reel, the once familiar workshop turning into something dark, something unrecognizable. No, not again. Not this. The figure appeared again, the shadow he had seen before, but this time it was different, larger, more monstrous, and now it was smiling. The grin was wide, grotesque, stretching from ear to ear, exposing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged to be human. Elliot tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The figure stepped forward, its long, stretched limbs moving with terrifying speed. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, locked onto him with an intensity that paralyzed him, a gaze that saw him in a way nothing else ever could. It wasn't looking at him as a man anymore. It was looking at him as a part of time, an object, an entity that could be discarded. "You are a part of me now," the figure hissed, its voice a dark, guttural growl that seemed to rattle the very air around them. "Time has claimed you, and time will take you back." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He had no more fight in him, no more hope. Time had won, and as the shadow's hand reached toward him, his body grew colder, his vision dimming, the endless cycle beginning anew. The ticking of the watch echoed louder, more deafening, drowning him in its rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. And then, just like that, everything went silent. The silence was suffocating. It stretched out, cold and unbearable, pressing in on every side. Elliot couldn't feel the weight of his body anymore. He was no longer certain that he even had one. He was lost, untethered. The ticking, the relentless rhythm of time had stopped, but he still heard it, echoing in his mind, faint but undeniable. Had he died? The thought barely had time to form before the darkness around him began to shift. The absence of sound was replaced with a low hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate deep within his bones, reverberating through every fiber of his being. It was like the very fabric of reality was being rewoven, thread by thread. Time itself, once broken, was stitching itself back together. And then, like a sudden breath after being held for too long, the world snapped back into focus. Elliot gasped. He was standing in the workshop again, but it was different. The space was distorted, as though reality itself had become unhinged. The walls stretched and pulsed like living flesh, the shadows shifting and undulating in unnatural patterns. The clocks, once neat and orderly, now spun out of control, their hands moving erratically, backwards, forwards, sometimes even stopping completely before starting up again. The faint, flickering light above him buzzed incessantly, as if struggling to stay lit. And in the center of the room, on the workbench, was the watch. It looked the same, but Elliot could feel something was wrong. It was almost as though it had grown, become more than it had ever been. The symbol on the back, the labyrinthine spiral, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy as though it were alive. I'm not dreaming, he thought, panic creeping into his chest. He could feel the cold sweat on his skin, the thudding of his heart. His hands trembled as they reached out, compelled to touch the watch again. But as his fingers hovered above the surface, he hesitated. The last time he had touched it, everything had fallen apart. Is it still in control? Elliot couldn't remember when it had first begun, this strange dance between him and the watch. It felt like an eternity ago when he had first discovered its power, when he had thought he could control time. Now, he realized he had only ever been a pawn. It wasn't the watch that was broken. It was him. He was the one caught in the endless loop, a fragment of time lost between moments. He had broken time, and now it was broken with him. A low hum pulsed from the watch as his fingers brushed against its cold surface. A shiver ran through him. The moment he made contact, the room flickered, as though the very space around him was caught in a glitch. He felt his heartbeat quicken as he pulled his hand back, but it was too late. The air around him thickened with a strange presence. It's watching me. Elliot spun around, but the figure wasn't there, not yet. But the feeling of its presence was undeniable, creeping up his spine like a shadow that refused to let him go. It knows. The humming grew louder, almost deafening. It came from the very walls, the clocks, the watch, an unbearable crescendo that rattled his teeth and made his vision swim. The figure's voice, deep and hollow, reverberated through his skull. You cannot run from what you have made. Time is no longer a thing you control. You are its servant now. Elliot's breath hitched, his pulse racing. He stumbled backward, looking frantically around the room, but the figure was still nowhere to be seen. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, the space twisting, folding upon itself as though it were a page crumpled into an unreadable mess. What does it want from me? The question rang in his mind as the room began to fold in on itself, the walls distorting, becoming warped and alien. His own reflection in the nearby mirror blurred and fragmented, splitting into countless versions of himself, each one trapped, screaming for release. And then just like that, it stopped. The distortion ceased. The room solidified once more, its features restored to a warped but still familiar semblance. The clocks resumed their frantic ticking, each second slipping away, one after another, like water through his fingers. The figure appeared before him, this time standing right in front of him, so close that its features were nearly visible. It was no longer just a shadow. It was something tangible, its form rippling with shadows and light, its elongated limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its smile was wide, too wide, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were endless voids, like the depths of space itself. You are mine now, it hissed, its voice smooth and cold, like the whisper of the wind in a graveyard. You will never escape. Time has consumed you, and you will serve it forevermore. Elliot's body froze as its hand reached toward him, fingers long and cold, brushing against his skin. A shock of ice coursed through his veins, and he gasped, his chest seizing with the force of it. His mind screamed for him to move, to fight back, but it was like his very essence had been bound to the flow of time, paralyzed by its grip. He wanted to scream. He wanted to break free, but the words were trapped, choking him. The figure's hand slid across his face, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something flicker, something like pity in its void-like gaze. "You are not the first," the figure murmured, its voice a croon of dark understanding. "Many have tried to break the bond. None have succeeded." The figure tilted its head, studying him. "But you were different." Elliot's mind scrambled, trying to make sense of the twisted reality around him. Different? How was he different? He had tried control time. He had tried to master it. And now, he was nothing more than a broken moment. A fragment of time lost forever. "You will understand soon enough," the figure whispered, its voice fading into the air like smoke. And as it spoke, the workshop, his world, began to crumble once again. Elliot felt himself being pulled back, drawn into the spiraling darkness, his body weightless, his consciousness fragmented. The last thing he saw before everything fell away was the second hand of the watch, ticking with unrelenting precision. Tick, 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 and then nothing. The nothingness swallowed him whole. A crushing, suffocating void that seemed to stretch on forever, without form, without time, without end. He felt as though he were floating, drifting in an endless ocean of darkness, with no solid ground to stand on and no air to breathe. His body felt both heavy and weightless, an impossible contradiction. His thoughts, too, seemed to drift, unanchored, disconnected from reality. He couldn't tell how much time had passed, or if any time had passed at all. There were no markers, no clocks, no changes in light or shadow. Just endless, relentless silence. But then, there was a pull, a sudden shift, as if the very fabric of this void were unraveling, a crack in the endless dark. It began small, but grew stronger, like the sensation of being tugged by an invisible force. He tried to focus on it, to follow it, to understand it, but his mind was fragmented, like a shattered mirror. Pieces of memories of moments flashed in and out of focus. The watch. The thought lingered in his mind, clear but distant. The weight of it felt heavier now, more ominous than before. The watch was controlling him. It had to be. His fingers twitched, and for the first time, he realized they were no longer bound by the oppressive weight of nothingness. They moved, tentative at first, and then with more urgency. He wasn't sure why he moved, why his body had the will to act, but somehow he knew he needed to do something, to fight. But then came a voice, soft at first, then rising like the tide until it was all-consuming. "You cannot fight it," the voice whispered, low and venomous. "You belong to time now. It has claimed you, just as it claimed them." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice, the figure. His mind lurched. The darkness was starting to fade away. Shapes, vague and twisted, began to appear around him, floating in the distance like fragments of a dream. Slowly, they came into focus, and Elliot's breath caught in his throat. There were others, people, figures, all suspended in the void, locked in strange positions, as though frozen mid-action. Some were in motion. Some seemed to be reaching out for something, their eyes wide with terror. Others were simply still, their faces expressionless, lifeless. "No," Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, the people, the faces. They were people who had disappeared, people who had been lost to him, to time. He saw them all, scattered across the void, a gallery of souls trapped in a moment that never ended. His mind raced. Had he done this? Had he brought them here? He recognized some of the faces. The old man who used to sit in the cafe, the child whose ball had rolled into the street, the woman who had passed him by in the city. Each one was a victim, a prisoner of this broken world. The ones who had been caught in the ripples of his attempts to control time. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He had caused this. They are yours to guide now. The voice purred, growing louder. It was the figure. Its form was still out of sight, but the presence was undeniable. It surrounded him like a shroud, suffocating, pulling him into the darkness. You are the thread that connects them all, the one who wove their fate. And now, it paused, its voice thick with amusement. Now you will lead them, just as you have been led. The figures around him began to move, their eyes locking onto him with hollow stares, empty of life, of agency. They were trapped, like him, stuck in an endless cycle of moments, forever frozen in time, their bodies forever suspended. Elliot staggered back, his chest tight with dread. This can't be real. It can't be real. The voice was drawing closer now, and someone stepped forward from the swirling fog. A shadowy silhouette, tall and looming. Its presence was too familiar, too terrifying. And then it emerged from the shadows. It was him. Elliot blinked, disoriented, his mind reeling. The figure that stood before him was a twisted reflection of himself, tall, gaunt, and stretched thin, its face a grotesque mirror of his own. Its eyes, black, empty voids, stared at him, not with recognition, but with a cold, calculating hunger. You are no longer the man you once were, the figure whispered, its voice echoing through the space. You have become one with time's endless flow. You are a fragment, a shadow, a moment. Elliot took a step back, but the figure reached out with long, thin fingers and grabbed his arm. The cold was unbearable, colder than anything he had ever known. A freezing chill spread through his skin, reaching deep into his bones. You will lead them, it murmured again, its grip tightening. They are yours to guide. You will be the one to weave their fates now, just as time has woven yours. Elliot tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the void. The figure's laughter echoed in his mind, a cruel sound, like the tolling of a bell that marked the end of everything. Suddenly, there was a shift. The darkness around him seemed to shudder, as though it were coming to life. The figures began to move more violently, the frozen people now stirring in a grotesque dance. Their limbs jerked, their bodies contorted unnaturally, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. You are a part of the clock now, the figure said, its voice low and resonant. A piece of the ticking, the pulse, and you will never escape. Elliot struggled, but it was futile. The weight of time's grip on him tightened, dragging him deeper into the abyss. The watch, somewhere in the distance, ticked again, louder and louder, until it was deafening. And as the world collapsed around him, his vision faded to black, the sound of the ticking the only thing left in existence. Tick, tick, tick. The ticking echoed in his mind, relentless and deafening. It was as though the sound had become his world, consuming everything, drowning out his thoughts, his breath, his very existence. Elliot felt himself slipping again, the darkness rising to claim him. But this time, something was different. There was an awareness in the darkness, a sense of movement. His body no longer felt like his own, but it was still tethered, still fighting against the inevitable. He could still feel the cold hand of the figure on his arm, the touch that sent waves of frozen dread through his veins. But now it was as though the touch was fading, like he was being pulled away from it, pulled out of the grasp of time. The ticking continued, steady and constant. But now it wasn't just the ticking of the watch. It was the pulse of everything, of life, of the universe itself. Each tick reverberated through him, each pulse an agony of unknowing. Am I dying? The question clung to him, but it was fleeting. It didn't matter. It felt like it never had mattered. Time had long since lost its meaning. He had crossed into something else entirely, some twisted dimension between moments, a space where time had no hold, no beginning, no end. And yet there was something else too, a distant whisper, faint and fragile, a voice that seemed to reach out to him through the void, familiar yet foreign. Elliot, the voice, his name. He blinked, trying to focus, trying to find it, whatever it was that had called him back. There was something in the voice that felt like hope. He didn't know how he knew that, but it was undeniable. Elliot, The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was like a string being pulled, unraveling the darkness piece by piece. His body shuddered as the void around him began to break. The shadows, the figures, the twisted images of frozen people, all of it began to disperse. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air felt warmer. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on him eased, and he could breathe again. He opened his eyes. At first, the world around him was a blur. His mind, fractured and tired, struggled to comprehend the changes. But gradually, as his vision cleared, he realized he was no longer suspended in the black void, no longer trapped in that terrible limbo. He was back in the workshop. The familiar scent of oil, wood, and the faint tick-tick-tick of the clocks surrounded him. The walls were solid once more, the shelves lined with tools, the workbench standing where it had always stood. His fingers trembled as he touched the cool surface of the bench, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. It was real. He was back, but it was wrong. The room was distorted, like a photograph caught in a moment of static, out of focus. The clocks, once so meticulously arranged, were now chaotic, spinning in every direction, their hands moving at impossible speeds. The air seemed to hum with the pressure of something unseen, something powerful, thrumming just below the surface. And there, in the center of it all, was the watch, still resting on the workbench, but now it seemed to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light. The spiral symbol on the back of the watch pulsed with each tick, glowing brighter with every beat. It was no longer just a part of the watch. It was the heart of it, the essence of everything. A chill ran down Elliot's spine as he slowly reached for the watch. This time, he didn't hesitate. His fingers brushed against the cool metal, and as soon as he touched it, a jolt of energy surged through his body, shooting through his veins like electricity. He gasped and pulled his hand back, but the energy didn't fade. It stayed with him, a presence in his mind, a voice that whispered in the corners of his consciousness. "You cannot run from it, Elliot." He froze. That voice was unmistakable. The figure's words echoed in his head. You were already bound to it. The humming sound grew louder, and the clocks around him began to spin faster, their hands blurring together in a frenzy of motion. Time had reclaimed him. No matter how hard he tried to resist, no matter how much he fought against it, the watch, the symbol, the figure, it had him. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something shifted. The room, no, the entire world around him, seemed to bend, folding in on itself like a shattered mirror, the pieces scattering, reshaping. For a brief moment, he could see the edges of reality crack, like glass under pressure. A rift, a tear, widening with each second, pulling at him, threatening to swallow him whole. The watch pulsed again, brighter now, and for a split second, Elliot caught a glimpse of something else, another place, another time. It was a fleeting image, like a dream half remembered. He saw faces, his face, and the faces of the others, the ones trapped in time's grip, frozen in that endless loop. He saw himself, the twisted reflection that had appeared in the void. You cannot escape it. The figure's voice whispered again, and the room darkened, the edges of his vision fraying. You are part of the cycle, part of the watch. The rift in reality grew wider, pulling him toward it, and Elliot felt the pull with a deep, primal fear. His body was no longer his own, his thoughts slipping away, slipping into the rhythm of the watch. The rift swallowed him, and in that final moment, the ticking stopped. For the briefest of seconds, there was silence, but not for long. A new ticking began, different, louder, and it was coming from somewhere else. The cycle was beginning again. The silence that had briefly held him in its grasp was shattered by the relentless sound of ticking. Not the same rhythmic pulse he had known, but a deeper, more resonant ticking, something older, something more ancient. It echoed through the fabric of his being, like the heart of an old, forgotten machine, a mechanism long buried beneath layers of time. Elliot's eyes snapped open, but the world around him was nothing like he had known. He was no longer in the workshop. There was no familiar smell of wood, No comforting hum of the clocks. Instead, he was standing in an open field under a darkened sky, the stars swirling above him in chaotic patterns. The ground beneath his feet felt wrong, soft, unstable, as though the earth itself was in constant flux. The air was thick, suffused with a strange energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up. And the ticking. It was coming from all directions, a sound so pervasive that it seemed to fill the very air, vibrating through his chest. The source was nowhere to be seen, but it was everywhere, surrounding him, seeping into his mind. Elliot's breath quickened as he tried to make sense of what was happening. His hands trembled at his sides. Was he dreaming? But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt too real. The sensation of the ground beneath his feet, the weight of the air, the cold sting of the wind, it all felt far too tangible. He staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest, but before he could make sense of his surroundings, a shadow moved in the distance. A figure, a silhouette. It stepped forward, emerging from the edge of the field like a wraith emerging from the fog. The figure was tall, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, just like the one that had tormented him before, the one whose presence haunted his every waking moment. But this time, there was something different about it, something stronger, more solid. Elliot's body froze in terror as the figure came closer, its shape shifting and swirling, as if it were not entirely of this world. It reached out with an elongated hand, and the air around it seemed to distort, like a dark mirage on a scorching day. And then the voice came again. "You think you can escape?" It was the figure's voice, but it was deeper, more distorted now, like the echo of a nightmare that refused to let him wake. Elliot took a step back, the grass crunching beneath his boots. His mind raced. Escape? Was that what he had been trying to do this whole time? But how could he escape when he had never truly understood what he was running from? Was he even running at all? The figure's face slowly became visible, but its features were not those of a man or any recognizable shape. It was a hollow, shifting void, an absence of definition. Its eyes were two bottomless pits, endless, staring straight through him. "You are nothing more than a fragment," it whispered, each word like a strike to his core. "A broken piece in the puzzle of time. You will never be whole again." Elliot clenched his fists, trying to push back the rising panic. He had been here before. This had all happened before. The clocks, the endless loops, the broken moments. But this time, it was different. It had to be. His thoughts were interrupted by the loud crack of something shattering. The ground beneath him cracked open. A chasm, a vast, gaping hole, split the earth apart in front of him. The edges of the rift were jagged and sharp, like broken glass. And from the depths of it came a pull, a force that seemed to drag him toward it, like gravity itself had turned against him. The air grew colder as the chasm widened, a deep, unnatural darkness radiating from the heart of it. He could hear the ticking again, louder now, as if the clocks themselves were screaming from the depths of the rift. He could feel it, the pressure, the weight of time itself trying to force him in, to pull him into the void. "No!" Elliot whispered, his voice strained, his feet rooted to the ground. He couldn't move. The chasm was pulling him closer, and the figure watched, its eyes gleaming with cold amusement. You cannot fight time. Elliot's thoughts were a blur. His body felt heavy, as though the rift itself was draining him, siphoning away his very essence. But then something snapped. A surge of clarity shot through him. He was not helpless. He had been tricked before, but not again. He had felt the power of the watch before. He had felt its control, its twisted grip on his soul. But now, in this moment, he realized something. The watch wasn't controlling him. It was merely a tool, a means to an end. It had been the figure all along, weaving the illusion, feeding on his fear and confusion. The figure and the watch were not the same. They were connected, yes, but not inseparable. He had power here. He just had to remember. With a scream that was part rage, part defiance, Elliot reached out. His hand was trembling, but he pushed forward, ignoring the pull of the chasm, the tick-tick-tick that threatened to drive him insane. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the watch on his wrist, And in that instant, he felt it, its pulse, its energy surging through him. It was as though he had become one with it. He could feel time itself vibrating through him. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like a part of something larger, something vast and untamed. He was time. Time wasn't a force that controlled him. He could control it. The rift before him began to close, the jagged edges knitting themselves together like the fabric of the universe being mended. The figure hissed, its form flickering, as if the very essence of it was beginning to unravel. No, it screamed, its voice breaking and distorting. But it was too late. The ticking grew louder until it was deafening, and in a flash of light, the figure shattered, dissolving into nothingness, scattered into fragments like dust in the wind. The chasm closed completely. The world around him began to shift again, the stars above rearranging into a new pattern, a pattern that felt right. The earth beneath his feet solidified, the ground now firm, unshaken. Time was no longer fighting him. It was now his to command. Elliot stood tall, breathing heavily but resolutely, staring into the distance. The darkness was gone. The void was empty. He was free. And this time, he wasn't just a prisoner of time. He was time. The silence was unnerving. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was no ticking, no whispers from the void, no chasm pulling at his soul, just stillness, a fragile, almost unnatural stillness. Elliot took a step forward, expecting the world to shift, for time to stutter and fracture again, but nothing happened. The stars overhead no longer swirled in chaotic patterns. The sky was vast, dark but calm. The earth beneath his feet felt real, solid. Was it over? His fingers curled instinctively around the watch still strapped to his wrist. It felt different now. Not a curse, not a shackle, but a weight, something he could feel humming through him. He had won. He had shattered the figure, closed the chasm. He had a breath. Not his. Elliot froze. The air behind him had shifted. The temperature dropped in an instant, his breath now visible in the cold. A presence loomed, its weight pressing down on him like the gravity of a collapsing star. Slowly, so painfully slowly, he turned his head, and there it was, standing just a few feet away, in the same impossible black suit, its limbs unnaturally long, its face a shifting, empty void. The figure. It had reformed. No, that wasn't right. It had never left. Elliot's breath hitched as realization struck like a thunderclap. He hadn't escaped. He had only moved forward, deeper into the cycle. The figure cocked its head, those endless void-like eyes piercing through him. Then, it did something it had never done before. It smiled. A jagged, impossible grin split across its empty face, revealing rows of shifting, interlocking teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth. The ticking returned, not from the watch, from inside him. A deep, resonant talk echoed from within his own chest, vibrating through his ribs, rattling his bones. He staggered backward, clutching at himself, his pulse accelerating as if something inside him had rewound. The figure took a step closer. You thought you understood. It whispered, its voice 1,000 echoes layered on top of each other. But you were still a prisoner. Elliot's hands trembled. No, he breathed. I broke the cycle. You became the cycle, the figure interrupted. You're no longer just in time. You are time. Elliot's heart pounded in terror. The truth settled over him like a suffocating weight. He had never escaped. He had become what he feared, and the ticking would never stop. Elliot staggered backward, but there was nowhere to go. The weight of the figure's presence pressed against him, suffocating, inescapable. The ticking in his chest grew louder, an unnatural rhythm that did not belong to him. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. His hands clutched at his ribs, but there was nothing he could hold, nothing he could stop. The figure took another step forward, its impossible grin widening. You feel it, don't you? It whispered, the gears turning, the hands moving. Elliot squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently. No, this isn't real. This isn't happening. You are time's vessel now, the figure continued, its voice dripping with something almost amused. You wound the watch one too many times, and now it winds you. Elliot's legs buckled. He fell to his knees. The ticking within him grew erratic, mismatched, as if something inside him was shifting, twisting. "No," he gasped. "I control it. I control time." The figure knelt before him, its elongated fingers stretching out, stopping just before his face. "You were never in control," it whispered. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reached into Elliot's chest. Pain exploded through him. Not the pain of something breaking, but something unlocking. His back arched, a scream tearing from his throat as his body convulsed. The world around him blurred, fractured. Reality stuttered. He could see it, time unraveling, not just around him, but through him. His body flickered, shifting between moments, past and future clashing violently. His hands, his own hands, looked wrong. They aged and de-aged in an instant, skin tightening, then wrinkling, then tightening again. He saw glimpses of himself at different points in time, his body reshaping, breaking, reforming. He was becoming unmoored. The figure leaned in close, whispering directly into his ear. "You are not a man anymore, Elliot." The ticking reached a fever pitch. "You are a clock." And then the world shattered. Elliot opened his eyes. He was in the workshop. The same wooden shelves, the same scent of oil and dust. The clocks lined the walls, ticking in their quiet, methodical rhythm. The workbench stood before him, tools neatly arranged. The watch, the cursed, impossible watch, rested on the table, its face gleaming under the dim light. For a moment, everything felt normal. But then he saw it. His hands. They weren't his hands anymore. They were fractured, translucent, the edges shimmering like glass catching the light at the wrong angle. He flexed his fingers, and for a brief second, they glitched, skipping through different versions of themselves, young, old, skeletal, non-existent. His stomach turned. He stumbled away from the workbench, knocking over a pile of papers. He caught a glimpse of something shiny in the reflection of the brass clock on the shelf. He turned toward the mirror hanging on the far wall, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. It was shifting, warping. At times, it looked like him, his normal face, his tired eyes. But then it changed. His features melted, stretched. His mouth twisted into something wrong, something inhuman. His eyes darkened into endless voids. His limbs grew long and thin, distorting into something impossible. His reflection smiled, a grin, jagged, sharp, endless. The same grin the figure had worn. Elliot's breath hitched. He stumbled away from the mirror, shaking, clutching at his arms. His heartbeat was erratic, mismatched with the ticking inside him. Then, in the silence, the whisper came. Not from behind him, not from the mirror, from within him. "You understand now, don't you?" The ticking continued. Elliot did not scream, because deep down, he finally knew the truth. He had never escaped. He had only become the next piece of the cycle. And somewhere, in another place, another time, someone else would find the watch. And the ticking would begin again. The days blurred together. Or had been weeks. Months? Elliot couldn't tell anymore. Time no longer moved the way it once had. The clocks in the workshop continued their steady rhythm, their hands gliding along in perfect harmony. But Elliot knew better. He could feel the inconsistencies, the way the seconds stretched and shrank in ways imperceptible to normal eyes. Except he wasn't normal anymore. He watched his hands as they flickered in and out of different versions of himself. Young, old, somewhere in between. At times, his fingers became impossibly long, too many joints bending at unnatural angles. Other times, they were barely there, just a blur where his hand should be. He had become unstuck, but the worst part wasn't the shifting. It was the knowing. Elliot saw time differently now, not as a straight path, but as a tangled mess of overlapping moments, all happening at once. Every possibility, every version of reality. He could feel them pressing in on him, whispering in the space between each ticking second. The workshop door creaked open. Elliot's head snapped toward it, though he already knew what he'd see. A man stepped inside, Young, maybe early 20s. Curious eyes scanning the rows of clocks with a mix of fascination and unease. Elliot recognized the look. He had worn it himself once. The young man's gaze landed on the watch resting on the workbench. His hand twitched. Elliot wanted to scream, to warn him, to stop him, but he didn't move. He couldn't, because he understood now. This was how it had always happened. The young man reached out, his fingers brushing against the watch's surface. And as he picked it up, the ticking grew louder. The cycle began again. Elliot watched in silence as the world around him stuttered, the hands of the clocks shifting ever so slightly. And then, for the first time, he smiled. The young man turned the watch over in his hands, tracing the delicate engravings along its surface. His expression was one of admiration, curiosity, even. Elliot remembered that feeling, the thrill of discovery, the quiet hum of something important hidden beneath the mundane. But that thrill had been a lie, hadn't it? A lure, a hook cast into the depths of time itself, waiting for another unsuspecting soul to take the bait. And now it was happening again. Elliot should have stopped him. He should have warned him, but his body didn't move. It wouldn't move, because it wasn't his anymore. Beautiful piece, isn't it? Elliot heard himself say. The words left his mouth, smooth and practiced, as if someone else had placed them there. The young man looked up, startled. He hadn't noticed Elliot standing there before. His fingers twitched around the watch, but he didn't let go. Yeah, the young man said. Where did you find something like this? Elliot wanted to tell him the truth, that he hadn't found it at all, that it had found him, that it had existed long before this shop, before this town, before time had even settled into something humans could comprehend. But instead, he said, it's been here a long time. The young man nodded, still studying the watch. Does it work? Elliot felt something deep inside him shift. Yes. The young man hesitated, his fingers hovering over the crown. Elliot felt the universe tighten. A single moment stretched impossibly thin. A delicate thread waiting to be cut. The young man turned the crown. A sharp click. The workshop shuddered. The air grew heavy, charged with something unseen. The clocks on the walls skipped, just for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to someone untrained. But Elliot felt it, heard it. The gears had started turning again. The young man frowned, suddenly uneasy. He glanced around, as if sensing something just beneath the surface of reality. Did you? Elliot smiled, not because he wanted to, but because the cycle demanded it. You'll get used to it, Elliot said. The words burned inside him. The young man looked uncertain, but something in Elliot's expression must have reassured him. Or maybe the watch was already working its way into his mind, whispering promises he didn't yet understand. Either way, it was too late. Elliot watched as the young man slid the watch into his pocket. He didn't know it yet, but time had already taken hold of him. And soon, he'd learn. Soon, he'd understand. Just like Elliot had. The clocks resumed their steady ticking. And somewhere, deep within the fabric of time itself, something smiled back. The young man lingered in the shop for a few moments, glancing around at the countless ticking clocks lining the walls. He looked like he wanted to ask something, maybe about the watch, maybe about the sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the air, but he said nothing. Instead, he nodded politely, murmured a quiet thanks, and stepped toward the door. Elliot watched him go, unable to move, unable to warn him. The moment the door swung shut, a shudder rippled through the shop. It was subtle, like the settling of an old building after a storm. The hands of the clocks trembled, then resumed their rhythm. The air pressed in around Elliot's skin, thick with the weight of something unseen. It was done. The cycle had begun again. Elliot turned slowly, his gaze settling on the workbench where the watch had been. His hands twitched, aching to reach for something that was no longer there. But it didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to him, the new keeper, the new prisoner. For now, Elliot exhaled a slow, measured breath. He knew what would come next. He had lived it, after all. The young man would feel the ticking before long, vibrating just beneath his skin, a phantom pulse that would never quite sync with his own heartbeat. He'd hear whispers in the moments between seconds, feel time stretch and contract around him in ways no one else could perceive. And soon, he'd see it. The figure. The thing that watched from the edges of time itself, smiling its impossible grin. The workshop felt smaller now, the walls pressing in just slightly. Elliot rubbed his temple, though it did nothing to soothe the dull ache forming behind his eyes. He wondered how long he had left. He wondered how long it would take before the world finally swallowed him. Because that was the real secret, wasn't it? There was no escape, no breaking the cycle, no stopping it, no loopholes. Elliot had become part of it now. And when time was ready, when it had taken all that was left of him, he would fade. Like the keepers before him, like the ones after. Another whisper crawled through the air, slipping beneath his skin, curling into his bones. Tick-tock. Elliot closed his eyes, and somewhere, beyond the walls of the shop, the young man took his first step toward the inevitable. Elliot waited. That was all he could do now. Time passed, not in the way it used to, not in the way most people understood it. It folded in on itself, stretched thin, then snapped back into place. Hours could feel like seconds, and seconds could drag on for eternity. But Elliot knew, deep in his unraveling soul, that it was only a matter of when. The young man, he didn't even know his name, would come back. They always did. At first, they tried to ignore it. The ticking, the way their reflection moved just a fraction too late when they turned their head. The sensation of something watching from the edges of their vision. And the dreams would start. Elliot had seen them before. The same winding corridors of shifting time, doors that led to past lives, to moments that had already happened, or ones that hadn't yet. Shadows whispering in the silence. Hands reaching from places that shouldn't exist. And then, the figure. Always the figure. Its jagged grin. Its shifting hollow eyes. The way it never moved quite like it should. Elliot clenched his fingers into fists. His reflection, caught in the glass of a nearby clock, twitched. He turned away from it. It was happening faster this time. That was the thing. Each cycle, each new keeper, it got worse. The cracks in time deepened. The gaps widened. He could feel himself slipping further. He wondered if he'd make it to the next cycle, or if he would simply dissolve into time itself, leaving only an empty space where Elliot used to be. The door creaked open. Elliot knew before he even turned that it was him. The young man stood in the doorway, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. The watch was still in his pocket. Elliot could feel its pull from across the room, could hear the faint, uneven ticking inside the boy's chest. "It's broken," the young man said, his voice tight. Elliot tilted his head. "Is it?" The young man hesitated. His lips parted, then shut. He didn't understand it yet. Couldn't. He only knew that something was wrong. He stepped forward, pulling the watch from his pocket and placing it on the workbench. It won't stop ticking. I took the battery out. I tried to break it, but his breath hitched. Elliot saw it then, the moment he realized, the moment every keeper realized. The watch wasn't the thing that was broken. He was. Elliot should have felt sorry for him. He should have told him the truth. Should have tried, at the very least, to help him. But his own time was running out. He could feel it pressing in on him, unraveling him from the inside. He was stretched too thin, his edges fraying, his reflection distorting more and more each day. There was no place for him in the next cycle. Only the new keeper, the young man. Elliot forced himself to smile. "You should keep it," he said. "It belongs to you now." The young man shook his head. "I don't want it." Elliot leaned forward, his voice calm, steady. "It's not about what you want." A deep, slow tick echoed through the room, from within the young man's chest. And Elliot knew what he was seeing, what he was feeling, the cycle, the inescapable, endless loop. The young man's eyes met Elliot's, wide with horror. Not from the watch. His breath stuttered. His hands trembled. And Elliot whispered, "You understand now, don't you?" The young man didn't answer. He didn't have to, because Elliot could already see it written all over his face. He remembered that feeling. He had lived it before. And now, it was time for someone else. Elliot stood, stepping back from the workbench. The air around him shuddered, like something coming undone. This was it, his final moment. The cycle had chosen its new keeper. Elliot felt himself slipping, felt the ticking in his chest slow. And then silence. For the first time in so long, Elliot felt nothing. The clocks continued to tick. The young man stood frozen in place, the watch still resting on the workbench. And Elliot was gone. Not dead, not vanished, just erased, like he had never existed at all. And somewhere, beyond the walls of the workshop, time began turning once again. The shop was still. The ticking of the clocks filled the air, as constant and unyielding as it always had been. The young man stood motionless in front of the workbench, the watch in his trembling hand, the faint hum of its mechanism vibrating through his palm. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and something darker, fear. He could still hear the echoes of Elliot's words in his ears, even though he was gone now. It's not about what you want. The young man wanted to scream, to throw the watch down and run out of the shop, but his body wouldn't move. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing in from all sides, holding him in place. Every clock on the walls ticked in perfect synchronization, like a symphony of madness, and the silence that followed Elliot's disappearance only made the sound louder. He felt the pull of the watch, the way it wanted him to understand. Time stretched, warped, and then a flicker. The young man blinked, and for a moment, the shop was gone. He was standing in the middle of a long, endless hallway, walls lined with clocks, each one ticking at a different pace. Some moved in slow, measured beats. Others skipped and stuttered, their hands shaking as if afraid to move forward. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, a twisting, bending corridor of time itself. And in the distance, he could see something or someone moving toward him. He tried to step back, to turn, but his feet were rooted to the ground. He was locked in place, frozen. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the ticking of the clocks surrounding him. Then, the figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and its movements too smooth. The face was a blur, just a dark, hollow void, with a grin that stretched far too wide to be human. The edges of its features shifted like a rippling mirage, always changing, always wrong. The young man gasped, trying to scream, but the air in his lungs wouldn't move. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The figure stopped in front of him, its hollow eyes locking onto his with a knowing gaze. "Welcome," the figure whispered, its voice a chorus of echoes, scraping at the edges of his mind. "You were always meant to join us." The young man's legs gave way beneath him, and he crumpled to the floor, clutching the watch in his trembling hand. The sound of ticking filled his ears, louder now, like a drumbeat that couldn't be silenced. "You are time now," the figure continued, crouching down to look him in the eye. "Not just a part of it, not just a passenger. You are it. Every moment, every memory, every second that passes. You will carry it with you, forever." The young man's eyes widened in terror, understanding slowly creeping into his mind. He could feel it now, the weight of the watch in his hand, a weight that wasn't just physical. It was the weight of eternity. The figure stood, towering over him. "Do you feel it? The pull of the cycle?" it asked, its voice now filled with something almost affectionate. "You cannot escape, not anymore. You become the keeper, the next step in time's endless march." Tears welled in the young man's eyes, but even as they fell, the clocks around him continued to tick. The air hummed with the static of unraveling moments, and the walls of the corridor began to warp, shifting like liquid time. "Join us," the figure repeated, the grin widening impossibly. "You cannot fight what you are." The young man clutched the watch harder, feeling his fingers start to fade, to blur as the reality around him crumbled. He could hear the tick of the watch, echoing in his chest, faster now, faster, a final breath. A final moment, and then silence. The hallway was gone. The figure was gone. The clocks were gone. And the young man was alone. In the shop, he stood, disoriented, shaking, but there was no trace of the hallway, no sign of the figure. It was just him now back in the same place. The same shop, the same workbench, the same watch, but he could feel it. He could feel time wrapping around him like a suffocating cloak. He could hear the ticking in his chest, in his mind. And when he looked into the reflection of the clocks, he saw the truth. He was no longer just a man. He was time, and the cycle had begun again. The young man's hand shook as he reached for the watch, placing it back on the workbench. It gleamed under the dim light, silent for the first time in what felt like centuries. But deep inside it, the ticking continued, waiting for the next keeper to claim it. The door to the shop creaked open. A new figure stepped inside, eyes wide with curiosity, with the same look the young man had worn before. And as he crossed the threshold, Elliot's smile, deep in the recesses of his mind, grew wider. Another would join. Another would fall into the cycle. And time would continue to tick. The shop felt different now. The young man, no, the keeper, stood motionless behind the workbench, staring at the new visitor. It was the same pattern, the same trap, unfolding just as it always had. But this time, it wasn't happening to him. This time, he was watching. The newcomer was young, maybe 20, with curious eyes scanning the rows of clocks with a mix of wonder and unease. He had no idea what he had just walked into. No idea that the moment he stepped through the door, time had already taken hold of him. The keeper's fingers twitched. A phantom ache crawled through his bones, the echoes of what had happened, what had been done to him, still fresh in his mind. He could still feel the way time had wrapped around him, hollowing him out, replacing his heartbeat with the unrelenting ticking. It was an unbearable weight, but now it was his to bear. The new visitor drifted closer, his gaze locking onto the watch resting on the workbench. It always happened the same way. The keeper's lips parted. He could warn him. He could stop it, but he didn't, because he understood now. Understanding had come too late for him, but it had come nonetheless. There was no stopping it, no breaking free. The cycle was a perfect, seamless loop, a closed system that devoured itself and began anew. The visitor reached out, fingers brushing the watch's surface. The keeper felt the universe tighten. A moment stretched impossibly thin, a delicate thread waiting to be cut. "You like it?" the keeper heard himself ask. The words felt foreign in his mouth, like they belonged to someone else. The visitor hesitated, then smiled. "Yeah, it's beautiful." The keeper exhaled. The words, the script, played out the same as before. He had said them. Elliot had said them before him. The visitor picked up the watch. A deep click echoed through the shop as he turned the crown. The clocks on the walls stuttered, just for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to anyone normal. But the keeper felt it, heard it. The gears had started turning again. The visitor frowned, glancing around, as if sensing something just beneath the surface of reality. "Did you?" The keeper smiled, not because he wanted to, but because the cycle demanded it. "You'll get used to it," the keeper said, his voice distant, hollow. The visitor looked uncertain, but something in the keeper's expression must have reassured him. Or maybe the watch was already working its way into his mind, whispering promises he didn't yet understand. Either way, it was too late. The keeper watched as the visitor slid the watch into his pocket. He didn't know it yet, but time had already claimed him. And soon, he'd learn. Soon, he'd understand. Just like the keeper had. Just like Elliot before him. The clocks resumed their steady ticking. And somewhere, deep within the fabric of time itself, something smiled back. The shop hummed with the steady rhythm of the clocks. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound was all-encompassing, filling every inch of the room, pushing out all else. The air seemed to thicken with each passing second, heavy with the weight of the cycles that had come before and those that would follow. The keeper stood still, watching the new visitor, a sense of inevitability creeping through him. He had been in this moment before, too many times to count. The feeling was the same. The creeping terror, the flickering realization that time had already wrapped itself around the newcomer, much like it had him, like it had Elliot. And soon, the visitor would become just another part of the unending loop. The young man, no longer a stranger to the strange rhythms of this place, stood frozen in front of the workbench. His hand clutched at his pocket where the watch rested. He could feel its pulse, its tug, its beckoning. It was only a matter of time before he understood that the watch wasn't just an object. It was a key to something far darker, far more ancient, than he could ever imagine. The keeper's body, though it felt like it was his, was no longer his own. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, anchored to this place by the relentless ticking of the clocks, his soul bound to time itself. He could feel his own edges unraveling, his reflection growing more and more disjointed in the glass of the clocks, just a flickering version of himself. But he was still here. He couldn't leave. None of them could. A sharp gasp pulled him from his thoughts. The visitor's eyes had widened, a flash of recognition darting across his face. He looked down at his pocket, then back at the keeper and the two locked eyes. The young man seemed to have some inkling, some hint of what was happening, though he couldn't quite articulate it. What's happening?" the visitor asked, his voice small, almost trembling. The keeper opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the words never came. He couldn't say them. They were lost to him now, buried beneath the layers of time. Tangled up in a web he had no power to untangle. He could only watch as the visitor slowly realized the truth. The ticking around them grew louder, more oppressive, as if the clocks were pushing in, surrounding them on all sides. The young man's hand slowly reached for his pocket, fingers trembling as they pulled to watch out. The air around him seemed to ripple with something unnatural. Time itself paused for just a second, just long enough for the keeper to realize what was happening. The watch shuddered. It was alive in a way no one could comprehend. The visitor's face twisted in confusion, terror mixing with curiosity. His fingers hovered over the watch's crown, and for the briefest moment, the keeper's heart, a heart that no longer truly beat, skipped. He felt it, the same dread he had once felt, the same moment of helplessness. "No, don't," the keeper whispered, though the words felt foreign coming from his mouth. But it was already too late. The visitor, hands trembling with fear, twisted the crown. Click! Time fractured. The world around them seemed to shudder, as if reality itself was splintering. The walls of the shop blurred. The ticking of the clocks became a maddening cacophony, their sounds growing in pitch, louder and louder until it was all that could be heard, drowning everything else out. The young man's eyes widened in terror. He staggered back, his face pale as his gaze fixed on the clocks. No, on the space between them, where shadows seemed to crawl, bending in unnatural ways. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tightening as the presence in the shop seemed to expand, filling the room with a crushing weight. The keeper could see it now, the figure, the same one he had encountered all those cycles ago. It was standing at the edge of the room, its face shifting, its grin impossibly wide, stretching far beyond the limits of the human face. Its hollow eyes locked onto the young man, and the air grew cold, so cold the keeper could feel it deep in his bones. The young man, his breath coming in sharp bursts, tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The door to the shop was gone. The windows were gone. He was trapped, and time, the unrelenting, all-consuming force, began to warp around him. The figure moved closer, impossibly fast, its presence filling every corner of the shop. The young man tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth opened and closed in a futile attempt, his eyes wide with terror as the figure reached out toward him, its long fingers stretching, impossibly long. "Join us." The voice was a hollow whisper, a chorus of whispers that scratched against the walls of the shop. "You are time now. You are its keeper." The young man's eyes flicked to the keeper. The recognition was instant, he knew. He understood what had happened, what was happening. His gaze locked onto the keeper's, searching for any hint of salvation, any sign that he could escape. But there was no escape. There never had been. The keeper's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, to ease the terror in the visitor's eyes, but there were no words. He was just another piece of time now, his fate sealed, just like all the others who had come before. And in that moment, as the figure loomed over the new keeper, the air thick with the sound of ticking clocks, the keeper understood. He would never be alone. Not anymore. Time had claimed him, and now it would claim him. The figure's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide. And somewhere, deep within the fabric of time itself, something smiled. The shop seemed to grow even darker, though the clocks continued their maddening rhythm, echoing through the suffocating silence that had overtaken the room. The young man, now fully aware of his fate, could no longer move. His body felt paralyzed, trapped in a reality that wasn't quite his own anymore, but one that was always waiting. The presence of the figure loomed over him like a shadow that was never meant to be cast. He felt the weight of the watch in his pocket, now far heavier than it ever had been, as if it were no longer just a timepiece but a burden. It pulsed, almost alive, throbbing with each tick, pushing deeper into his chest, wrapping around his ribs, entwining with his heartbeat. "Please, stop," the young man whispered, but his voice was thin, fragile, swallowed up by the oppressive ticking that flooded his mind. The figure, still smiling that grotesque, unnatural grin, bent down, bringing its hollow face closer to his. Its eyes were black, endless pits of nothing, reflecting the terror that now suffused the young man's heart. He could feel its presence pressing into his mind, his thoughts becoming fragmented, pulled apart like threads from an unraveling tapestry. "You are time now," the figure whispered again, its voice like the scraping of bone on stone. "You are its keeper. You can never leave. You cannot escape." The young man felt the weight of those words settle into his chest. It was not just the words themselves, it was the truth that they carried. He could feel it now, deep within him. Time wasn't just a concept. It wasn't just a measurement of moments, of hours and days. It was something living, breathing, an entity in its own right, and he was now bound to it, tied to its endless march. A cold sweat began to form on his brow as he realized what that meant. There would be no more walking away, no more life outside the shop, no more moments of freedom, no escape. The figure's grin widened even further, and the young man felt his insides turn to ice. He wanted to scream, but he had no voice. It was as if the very air had thickened, becoming something he couldn't breathe, something he couldn't escape. The figure's presence was suffocating, heavy, and it grew stronger with every passing second. He felt his limbs begin to lose their form, his body shifting, changing into something else. "Do you hear it?" The figure's voice was a low, soothing hiss now. "The ticking? It is time calling to you. It is time that is you now." The young man's vision blurred, the world around him spiraling, pulling into a vortex. The clocks on the walls, the ones that had once been so comforting, so normal, began to twist and warp, each one bending and folding in on itself, their faces morphing into something grotesque. The tick-tock became louder, more frantic, like a pounding heartbeat, reverberating in his chest. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably as he tried to reach for the pocket that contained the watch. He needed to take it out. He needed to stop it, but it was too late. His body didn't respond. It was as if his movements were no longer his own. And then the thing that had once been human, spoke once more. "You are the keeper of this place now. Your fate is sealed, just as his was, just as all of them before you." The figure's voice turned dark, heavy, laced with mockery, "just as it will be for all who come after you." The shop was silent for a moment, save for the incessant ticking. The young man's breath came in shallow gasps as his body continued to shift. His limbs felt as if they were made of something lighter, as though they were drifting apart, his form becoming unhinged, stretching, blending into the air, into the walls, into the very ticking of the clocks. He could feel it, the pulse of time inside of him, rushing faster now, unrelenting. "No, no," he whispered, but his voice was distant, barely his own. "I don't want this." The figure's laugh was soft, almost kind, as though it pitted the young man. "It doesn't matter what you want," it said, a cruel sweetness in its tone. "Time doesn't care about your desires. It only cares that you're bound to it. It only cares that you are here." The young man felt his soul, his very essence, tear as the force of time wrapped around him, squeezing him into a form that was both his and yet not his. His body was being pulled apart, becoming part of something greater, something eternal. The world around him began to fade, warping and unraveling, until there was nothing but the tick, the endless, overwhelming tick. The keeper, he was the keeper now, could feel his own identity slipping away, replaced by something ancient, something cold and cruel. He was becoming part of the shop, part of the clocks, part of the cycle. And then he knew. He understood, in the deepest pit of his mind, what he had to do, what he was meant to do. He was time. He was the anchor in the storm, the one who kept it all together. And like the others before him, he would pass on the watch. He would choose the next keeper. The young man, soon to be the next keeper, looked up, his eyes hollow and distant, his soul already slipping away, becoming part of the shop, becoming part of the cycle. The figure nodded in approval, as though this was precisely what it had been waiting for. Yes, it whispered, its grin widening. Soon, the cycle will begin again, and you will be the one to welcome them. The shop fell into silence once more. And time continued to tick. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. The tick-tock of the clocks, once an oppressive presence, had become a dull hum in the background, as though the very sound of time was now an unnoticeable part of the air. The young man's body, no longer his body, was no longer even a body. It had become part of the clocks, part of the walls, part of the very fabric of the shop. He could feel the pulse of time all around him, stretching through him, into every corner of the room. The sensation was dizzying, like being trapped inside a spiral that had no end. But there was still a thread of awareness within him. It wasn't his mind anymore, not entirely. Yet, he was aware of the new presence in the shop, the figure standing, waiting for the inevitable. The next victim, the next keeper. The door creaked open again, and the shop filled with the sound of it, the soft rustle of a new presence, a fresh moment of time entering the endless loop. A young woman stepped inside, her footsteps hesitant, her eyes wide with curiosity. She was different from the others. She wasn't just aimlessly wandering. She was looking for something. She knew something was wrong. The keeper, if he could still be called that, felt a jolt deep within. This was it. The cycle was about to begin anew. His gaze, or what remained of it, shifted to the woman. He could feel her hesitation, the way she was drawn to the clocks, the way they seemed to beckon her in the same way they had beckoned him, the way they had beckoned everyone. Her eyes locked onto the watch on the workbench, gleaming under the dim light, its surface gleaming like a promise, like a trap. She walked toward it slowly, as if the watch was pulling her in, piece by piece, like the creeping tendrils of fate. The keeper could feel it, the connection between the watch and her, the way time recognized her as the next soul to be bound. No, the keeper managed to whisper, though his voice was a fractured echo in the air. The sound came from deep within him, a memory of who he had once been, a faint cry for mercy that no longer had any meaning. The woman paused, turning toward him. Her expression was soft, puzzled, as though she had heard something that didn't belong to her. The keeper's heart thudded, but it wasn't his heart anymore. It was just the echo of something that once had a life of its own. What? What did you say? She asked, her voice trembling, but still full of curiosity. The keeper opened his mouth, but the words that left it were not his. They came from somewhere deep within time, from the very essence of the shop. You mustn't take the watch, the voice said. Once you do, you are bound. There is no escape. The woman blinked, her gaze flickering to the workbench, then back to him. Her expression shifted from curiosity to unease, and the keeper saw the fear begin to take root in her eyes. She could feel it too now, the presence in the shop. She could feel the weight of time pressing in around her, suffocating the space between breaths. But despite her hesitation, despite the warning, she moved toward the watch. Her fingers brushed it gently, just like the young man had done so many times before. The air seemed to snap. The clock faces began to tremble as though something was about to break, something unseen, something inevitable. The woman's fingers tightened around the watch, her breath quickening as she slowly lifted it. The keeper felt a surge of power rush through him, but it wasn't his power. It was the power of time, the ancient, cold force that wrapped itself around everyone who stepped through that door. The shop seemed to pulse with life, the walls creaking, the clocks ticking faster and louder until the sound was deafening. No, the keeper managed again, his voice more frantic now, but it was too late. The woman raised the watch to her face, her eyes searching it, as if trying to unlock its mystery. The second her fingers twisted the crown, the rune shifted. The wall seemed to bend and contort as time fractured once again. The air grew thick, suffocating with the weight of moments suspended, trapped between seconds. The woman's gasp was the only sound that pierced the madness. And then everything stopped. For a brief, impossible moment, the clocks were silent. The shop hung in suspended animation. The woman's face froze in a mask of terror as she stood, the watch in her trembling hand. She wasn't moving. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something that wasn't there, staring into the void of time itself. The keeper could feel it, the shift, the moment when she had crossed the threshold. She had taken the first step into the trap, just as he had, just as everyone before him had. The figure appeared again, its presence filling the room like smoke, swirling around the woman, its smile wide and twisted. It reached toward her, its long fingers brushing against her skin, and she shuddered, her eyes darting between the keeper and the figure. "Welcome," the figure whispered, its voice low and endless, like the deep, dark abyss. "Time has chosen you." The woman's mouth opened in a silent scream, her hands gripping the watch as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. But the keeper knew. He knew what she didn't. It was too late for her. She was already gone, already a part of the endless cycle. The shop was now hers. It had claimed her, just as it had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others before them. And the keeper watched, feeling the weight of eternity pressing into him, just as it had pressed into the ones who had come before him. His soul, stretched thin and worn, felt the truth sink in. Time would continue, no matter who came, no matter who stayed. The clocks would tick on, their relentless march never ceasing, and all those who entered would be swallowed by it. The young woman was now a part of the cycle, her essence fading as she was slowly absorbed by time. She would become the keeper when her turn came, and the shop would wait, eternally, for the next soul to step across its threshold, for the next unwitting victim to grasp the watch. And time would never stop. Never. The air in the shop seemed to tremble with the weight of time as the woman, now fully enveloped by the presence, slowly became a part of it. The room around her warped, shifting in impossible ways, stretching and contorting, as if time itself was bending and twisting, trapping her within its grasp. The woman's eyes, once filled with confusion and fear, began to lose their clarity. The spark of recognition flickered and then died, leaving nothing behind but an empty stare, like all those before her. The keeper, or what was left of him, could feel it. The feeling of her slipping away, her soul caught in the endless current of time, merging with the clocks, the walls, the very fabric of the shop. She had taken her place in the cycle, just as he had, just as they all had. The weight of her surrender pressed into the keeper's chest, suffocating him in the knowledge that this was now her fate, a fate he could no longer escape, and neither could she. The figure, the twisted entity that watched over them all, leaned closer to the woman, its voice as cold as the silence that stretched between moments. "It's time," it whispered, its voice a chorus of thousand-year-old echoes. "You will learn to serve time now. You will never leave this place, and you will never forget." The woman's mouth opened, her hands instinctively clutching the watch tighter, as though she could somehow hold on to what she had been, to what she had been before. But it was futile. The pull of time was inevitable. No one escaped it. Not her. Not him. And certainly not the one who had become a keeper. The keeper felt the shift inside him. It was subtle at first, but undeniable. He could sense the power of the watch, its unnatural weight pressing down on his soul. It was almost as if it were waiting for something, as though it could feel the passage of time and the moments of loss that came with it. His vision blurred, the walls of the shop stretching and collapsing like ripples in a pond. The figures of the past, the former keepers, flickered in the corners of his mind, their faces warped and twisted by the unrelenting march of time. They were all there, trapped in the same loop. And now, so was she. The figure that hovered by the woman's side reached out, its long skeletal fingers brushing against her skin. A jolt of cold shot through the air as the woman's body shuddered, her breath becoming shallow, her form shifting. She was becoming something else, something more. The keeper felt it, as if it was happening to him, as if he were slipping once again into the folds of time. He was no longer a person. He wasn't even an observer. He was a part of the shop now, a part of its endless, grinding loop. He could no longer remember what it had been like to be human. The concept of time outside this place was alien to him. All he knew now was the tick-tock, the hollow whispers, the constant churn of the clocks that never ceased. As the woman's transformation began, the shop seemed to expand, the ticking growing louder, more intense. The figures of the previous keepers, those who had come before and those who would come after, began to take shape in the dim corners of the room. Their hollow eyes, their empty stares, locked onto the new keeper. "You will learn," one of the keepers whispered, their voice echoing from the farthest corner of the shop. "You will become one with time, just like the rest of us. You will forget who you were." Another keeper stepped forward, their form distorted, stretched out of shape by time itself. "The clocks do not stop. They never stop. Neither will you." The woman, now fully merged with the force that had claimed her, slowly turned to face the keeper. Her expression was blank, a void behind her eyes, but the recognition was there. She knew. She understood. She had become part of it. And as her voice, now hollow and far away, broke through the silence, the keeper felt the weight of it. The words that followed would shape everything. It would be her turn to speak the warning next. "I'll wait," she said, her voice low, but carrying the weight of eternal understanding. "I'll wait for the next one, for the next soul to come." The shop seemed to hum in response, as though time itself had acknowledged her declaration. It was a promise that had been made before, a promise that would be made again and again, over and over. The cycle continued. The next would come. The next would be claimed. And so, the shop settled back into its steady, suffocating rhythm. The clocks ticked louder now, as if the weight of the cycles had gathered once again. The keeper, no longer a person, but a part of something far darker, turned toward the doorway, watching, waiting for the inevitable. For time was eternal. It could never be stopped. The shop would always remain. And when the next soul entered, it would find its place. Time never relented. It only continued. It would claim them all. The shop settled back into its oppressive stillness, the clocks ticking on in perfect synchronization. The woman, now one with the shop, the cycle, stood motionless, her hollow eyes staring into the distance. No longer a person, but an extension of time itself. The keeper could feel her presence, the weight of her transformation, as though she had always belonged to this place. The idea of who she had been, who any of them had been, faded, lost beneath the relentless ticking. But the keeper, or what remained of him, couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Even though he had long since lost the ability to think of escape, there was a strange shift in the air, as if time itself were aware of the change. He could sense the pulsing energy of the shop, could almost hear it whispering to him, telling him things he couldn't quite understand but felt deep within his fading soul. The door creaked, a soft sound, but enough to send a shiver through the keeper's faded form. His attention snapped to the entrance as the door opened slowly, an unfamiliar sound joining the clattering ticks of the clocks. The woman, the new keeper, stood still, her empty eyes focused on the entrance, as though expecting this moment. A man stepped inside. The keeper could feel it immediately. The man had no idea what he was walking into, the same way the others hadn't. He was drawn in by the same thing, the pull of the shop, the pull of the watch. The keeper saw him glance around with a mixture of curiosity and unease, his eyes catching on the shelves filled with clock faces of all shapes and sizes, his fingers twitching as though he could feel the weight of time pressing on him. The man hesitated by the door, his gaze flickering to the woman, who remained frozen in place. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, confusion clouding his face. Then, his gaze moved to the workbench, to the watch that sat there, gleaming like a beacon. "No," the keeper whispered, though it was more of a broken thought than anything coherent. He couldn't speak, not fully. He couldn't warn the man, couldn't scream. All he could do was watch as the man stepped further into the shop. The woman, though frozen, knew. The keeper could feel it. She was aware of the new arrival, just as she had been aware of him when he had first entered. There was no hesitation in her now, no fear. She was a part of this now, and she was waiting for the cycle to begin again. The man took another step forward, his eyes locked on the watch. The air seemed to thrum around them, the ticking intensifying, vibrating through the floor, through the walls. The room felt like it was closing in, the clocks pressing tighter, as though they could sense his arrival. He reached the workbench and, with a slight tremor in his hand, picked up the watch. The moment his fingers touched it, the shop seemed to freeze. Time itself held its breath. The keeper's heart, what remained of it, shuddered. He felt the energy of the room shift again. The cycle was about to repeat, the trap closing in. He could feel the pull of the watch on the man, the way it called to him, just as it had called to him and all the others. The man's body stiffened, his hand clutching the watch tighter, and the keeper could feel the presence of the entity, the figure, looming just beyond the edges of his vision. It was happening. The next keeper was being chosen. The door would close, the clocks would tick louder, and the cycle would begin again. But this time, something was different. The keeper could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. The figure was waiting, but there was something in the shop's atmosphere, a ripple, a tremor. The clocks ticked on relentlessly, but the keeper felt a shift in the flow of time, something off. Something wasn't aligning. The man, holding the watch, stared at it, his expression now one of awe, confusion, and something darker, a creeping realization. His gaze shifted slowly toward the woman standing motionless in the corner. Then, something strange happened. The clocks fell silent. A dead hush filled the room, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, there was nothing. No ticking, no whispering of time, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. The man dropped the watch. It landed on the workbench with a soft clink, but it was enough to shatter the silence. The air in the room grew thick with something ancient, something almost predatory. The clocks, every single one, began to tremble, shaking as though they were alive, as though they were reacting to the disturbance. The walls groaned, and the shop itself seemed to shudder as though it had been jarred from some deep slumber. The figure appeared in front of the man. For a moment, it seemed almost too close. Its presence was overpowering, its shadow stretching out and swallowing the room in a cold, suffocating haze. The man couldn't move, couldn't breathe, his eyes locked on the figure. "Do you think you can escape?" the figure whispered, its voice 1,000 broken whispers, so low, so haunting, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Do you think you can leave? Once you are chosen, there is no going back." The man's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His entire body was paralyzed by fear. He could feel the weight of the shop's time pressing in on him, suffocating him. The woman's gaze never left him. She had already been claimed, and soon so would he. But then, something unexpected happened. The man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance sparking within him. The keeper, still tethered to this place, felt a strange surge, something that felt almost like hope. The man took a step back, then another. The figure moved forward, its presence growing larger, but the man didn't falter. He turned and dashed toward the door, his footsteps clattering on the floor, louder than the ticking. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling, but then snapped, the door slammed shut. The shop was sealed. The ticking resumed. Louder, stronger, relentless. Tom had claimed him. The keeper's faded presence felt a new shift. The cycle had continued, but this time, it had been different. This was a new twist, an anomaly. For the first time, the keeper wasn't sure whether the cycle would ever end. The shop was once again swallowed by the unrelenting ticking, but it felt different now. The air was thick with something unseen, a shift in the rhythm that pulsed through the walls. The keeper could feel it deep within the marrow of his essence. The cycles were still in motion, but there was a sense of something more. The man who had entered, the one who had tried to escape, had somehow disrupted the flow of time, had broken the pattern, even if only for a moment. But no one had ever escaped. The shop was its own world, a world made of time, a place where the concept of escape was a mere illusion. And yet, the keeper felt a cold sense of uncertainty. The clock, still ticking away in perfect sync, somehow felt heavier. The presence of the figure that had been there before seemed to loom larger, as though it was waiting for something. Watching, the woman, the new keeper, remained silent, her hollow gaze still fixed on a now-closed door. Her body didn't move, but the keeper could feel the subtle shift in her awareness, a stirring. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of the design, and something in her seemed to wait. The moment stretched out, the ticking amplifying in the quiet. And then the shop responded. The walls groaned, their surfaces cracking as if time itself were stretching, adjusting, realigning. The faint sound of the door unlocking echoed through the room. The keeper's heart, what was left of it, skipped a beat. This was impossible. No one had ever left the shop. Not since the beginning. Not since the first keeper had been claimed. The door creaked open once more, but this time it didn't sound like it was opening for someone new. It was different. The keeper could feel in the air a strange weight, an almost painful pressure. The air shifted, becoming colder. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure unlike any the keeper had seen before. This one was not the usual distorted, shadowy being. No, this figure was alive. It was human, or at least it appeared to be, but there was something deeply wrong about it. The figure stepped inside the shop with a fluid, unnatural grace, its eyes piercing and calm. It felt older, ancient, yet undeniably aware. The room seemed to grow darker as it entered, as if the very fabric of time twisted to accommodate its presence. The woman, the new keeper, moved for the first time since the man's arrival. Her eyes locked onto the figure. There was no fear in her gaze, no recognition of the threat it posed. Instead, her expression shifted to something far colder. She stood there, waiting. The figure smiled, a slow, knowing curve of its lips, as if it understood the terrible truths of the shop, of what had become of the keeper and all who had been drawn into the cycle. It walked past the woman, moving with an eerie certainty toward the workbench where the watch lay, forgotten for the moment. "You've failed," the figure said, its voice smooth, yet laced with something ancient, something dreadful. The keeper could feel the weight of the words, a truth he had never dared to understand until now. Time had never been the true master of this place. There was something deeper, something darker that had always controlled the shop, something that had manipulated even the cycle of time. The figure reached down and picked up the watch, its fingers caressing its surface as if recognizing it for the first time. The clocks in the room ticked louder, as though reacting to the figure's touch, vibrating with power. "You thought you were the keepers," the figure continued, its voice dripping with a sense of finality. "But you were never meant to guard time. You were meant to serve it." The keeper's soul trembled. There was a truth in the figure's words that was both terrifying and exhilarating. They had been wrong all along. Time had not chosen them to protect it. They had been tools, puppets in a game they didn't understand. This shop, this place had not been their prison. It had been their purpose. The watch, the clocks, the ticking, those weren't just symbols of time. They were symbols of something greater, something older. The figure turned toward the woman now, its eyes locking with hers. "And now, it's your turn," it said almost gently, as if it were speaking to a child, an elder passing down the grim truth of their existence. "You are no longer the keeper of time, but its servant. Your turn to serve begins now." A sudden coldness filled the air as the figure raised its hand, and the watch began to glow, its surface shimmering with a pale, unnatural light. The clocks around the room slowed. The seconds stretched impossibly long, almost too much to bear. Then, in an instant, the woman collapsed to her knees, her face twisted in silent agony, her hands clutching at the watch as if trying to hold onto the last shreds of her identity. But it was useless. The presence of the figure, this ancient being, was overwhelming. The shop seemed to pulse with power, filling the room with an oppressive weight. The keeper felt it too, the pull of time stronger than before. The presence of the figure was consuming everything. The shop, the clocks, the walls, all of it seemed to bend toward the figure, as if it were drawing everything into itself. The figure watched with a cold, knowing gaze, its lips curling into a smile as the woman's transformation began. Her body stiffened, her movements jerky, as if she were becoming something else entirely. The clocks sped up, their ticks blurring into a constant hum as her form morphed, twisted, and reshaped. The agony in her eyes slowly faded as her body merged with the shop, just as all the others had before her. And then, as the last traces of her humanity were erased, the figure turned toward the keeper. "You were never meant to be free," it said softly, almost sympathetically. "None of you were." The keeper felt the truth wash over him like cold water, numbing and inescapable. There had never been freedom. Not for him. Not for any of them. The figure's form blurred and rippled, fading into the shadows. Its presence lingered for just a moment longer, and then it was gone. The shop, silent now, held only the ticking of the clocks. The cycle was complete once again, and the keeper, what was left of him, watched in a hollow, empty state as the door creaked open once more. And then the next soul would enter, and the cycle would begin again. The shop stood still, as it always had, with the relentless ticking of the clocks echoing throughout its walls, the very heartbeat of the place. The air was thick, pregnant with the weight of countless moments, all of them stretching out endlessly in the confines of time's prison. The keeper, what was left of him, felt the deep, hollow emptiness settling over him once again. The change that had come with the figure's departure lingered, a profound, suffocating weight that pressed against his fading consciousness. It was over. The cycle had completed, but it felt like a prelude to something much darker. Something was wrong. Even now, as the clocks resumed their perfect, mechanical rhythm, the keeper felt the nagging sensation that the rules of this place had been rewritten. The absence of the figure left a void, a hole in the very fabric of the shop that none of the previous keepers had ever known. The woman, the new keeper, was gone. Her transformation was complete, her essence now one with the shop. The keeper could feel her presence, indistinguishable from the tick-tock of the clocks, absorbed into the ever-churning mechanism. She was a part of it now, but there was no satisfaction in that. No relief. Only a slow, creeping awareness of how the endless cycle would unfold again and again. But the keeper couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. He had been wrong about so many things. The figure, it, had revealed something that sent a shiver through the remnants of his consciousness. Time wasn't what held the shop together. Time wasn't the master. Time was the prison. And now it seemed the cycle had changed. Time's power had been usurped by something else. Something darker. Something that had been lurking, waiting beneath the surface of the shop all along. The door creaked open again. The keeper's soul pulsed, thrumming with a mix of dread and anticipation. It was time. Time for the next soul to enter. But as the door slowly swung inward, there was a strange feeling in the air, a ripple, an unease. The clocks began to tick louder, faster, the sound distorted like a heartbeat speeding out of control. A figure appeared in the doorway. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't the kind of soul the shop usually drew in, lost and confused, drawn in by the allure of the watch. This person walked with purpose, not hesitation in their eyes, scanning the room with an unsettling calm. It was a man, young, perhaps, but there was something about him that immediately struck the keeper as different. His presence felt heavier than the others, as though he, too, could sense the subtle shifts that had occurred within the shop. He stepped inside with a fluid, confident stride, the door shutting softly behind him. The moment he crossed the threshold, the ticking of the clocks intensified, filling the room with a cacophony of sound, vibrating through the walls, through the very bones of the shop. It was as though the shop itself was reacting to his arrival. He stopped. His gaze flickered over the clocks, over the dust-covered shelves, over the workbench where the glowing watch lay. He didn't hesitate. His hand moved toward it almost instinctively. The keeper felt a deep stirring, a tremor of something ancient and forgotten. The man's fingers hovered over the watch, but there was something different about the way he moved, deliberate, certain, almost as if he had been here before. No, the keeper whispered into the vast emptiness, though it came out as little more than a breath, lost in the ticking. But the man heard it. His eyes shifted to the keeper, though he couldn't see him. His gaze moved toward the woman, who now stood frozen in her new form, her eyes empty, a lifeless husk that had long since lost any semblance of humanity. The man's expression didn't change, but there was something unsettlingly familiar in the way he surveyed the scene. "You can't keep me," the man said quietly, his voice cold, unwavering. The keeper's fading awareness flickered, a pulse of recognition flaring through him. This was no ordinary soul. This man was different. He wasn't just lost. He wasn't drawn in by the watch. He wasn't a pawn. He was something else entirely. The man turned away from the woman and the watch and walked deeper into the shop, moving past the clocks, moving past the shelves, as though seeking something more. His footsteps seemed to resonate in the air, like the tick-tock of the clocks themselves, matching the pulse of time. And then, something unexplainable happened. The clocks, each one, every single one, began to slow. The ticking faltered, stuttered, as if they were struggling to keep up with the man's presence. The shop seemed to shudder, the walls trembling, as though the very nature of time was warping under his influence. The keeper could feel it now, a crack in the fabric of reality itself. Time was breaking. The rules that had governed this place were slipping away. The man wasn't just part of the cycle. He was breaking it. He stopped in front of the large, central clock, the one that had been in the shop longer than anything else, its face ancient and covered in layers of dust and decay. The hands of the clock moved sluggishly, like they were pushing through thick tar, reluctant to obey. "Time," the man said, his voice growing louder, stronger. "Time is nothing but a cage. You've all been trapped in it, and I'm here to free you." The keeper felt a pang of panic. The clocks began to tick faster again, the sound rising to a deafening crescendo. The air crackled with energy as the man's words echoed through the room. The shop groaned. The walls bent, contorted, and the clocks vibrated so violently that some of them cracked, their glass faces shattering and scattering across the floor. The temperature in the room dropped, a chill seeping into the keeper's essence. The man reached out with both hands, pressing them against the central clock, and the world shifted. The keeper felt the space around him twist and warp, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The clocks, once so rigid, began to spin wildly, their hands spinning in impossible directions. Time fragmented, shattered into pieces. The very air itself seemed to split open, reality splintering into disjointed fragments. The man, standing in the center of it all, didn't flinch. His eyes were filled with purpose, filled with the determination of someone who had long known the truth. "You've all been bound by time," he muttered, as the clocks began to unravel. "But you're free now." The keeper felt the world around him begin to collapse, the ground beneath his feet no longer steady, no longer solid. He could hear the sound of cracking glass, the grinding of the clocks as they tore apart, as if they were being undone, as if the man's will had shattered the very nature of the shop. And then everything stopped. The ticking ceased. The air fell still. The shop was quiet. The man stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the chaos he had created. The clocks, now shattered and silent, lay scattered around him like fragments of a broken dream. Time had broken. The cycle had ended. And in that silence, the keeper realized one horrifying truth. The shop was no longer a place of time. It was a place of nothing. A place where the cycles no longer existed. A place where the ticking, the endless repetition, was no more. The keeper had no idea what would come next. But one thing was certain. They had been freed. And in that freedom lay a terrifying uncertainty. For in the end, what was left when time itself was gone? The stillness in the shop was suffocating. The air, once thick with the pulse of ticking clocks, now hung heavy, oppressive in its silence. The broken pieces of glass, the shattered clock faces, lay scattered on the floor like forgotten fragments of a dream. The man stood in the center of it all, as if untouched by the chaos he had unleashed. The keeper could feel the weight of the moment, as though the very essence of the shop had shifted, morphed into something unrecognizable. The man turned slowly, his eyes scanning the broken clocks, the shop that had once been a prison, and then, finally, the keeper. There was no expression of victory in his gaze, no sign of triumph. Instead, there was a calm, unsettling certainty, as though he had known all along what needed to be done, as though he had always understood what the others never could. "You're still here," the man said, his voice calm and measured. But there was something deeper in his words, something that hinted at a truth far darker than the keeper was ready to face. "I didn't expect that. But then again, I suppose it makes sense." The keeper's consciousness, what was left of it, reached out in confusion. He didn't understand. The cycles, the ticking, the eternal loop that had governed everything. Had it really all been undone? Was it truly over? The man took a step toward him, and in that movement, the shop seemed to contract, the space closing in on the keeper as if the walls themselves were watching. The stillness, once an oppressive force, now became something far more menacing, an absence that swallowed everything. "You've been waiting," the man continued, his voice drawing closer, a low murmur that vibrated through the keeper's very being. "You've been waiting for something to change, haven't you? To break free. But you never did. Not truly. You were part of the design. A cog. A tool. Just like all the others." The keeper felt a tremor of understanding ripple through him. The design. It was all true. The shop wasn't a place of time. It was a place of control. It was a mechanism, a prison built not to contain time, but to contain them. Each keeper had been nothing more than a vessel, a part of the system that perpetuated the cycle, keeping the shop alive, keeping it locked in an endless loop. Until now. "You think you've been freed?" the man said, his eyes narrowing. "You were never meant to be free. You were always meant to serve. You just like the rest." The keeper felt something snap within him, an instinctual surge of resistance, but it was weak, fading, fragmented. His very essence, what remained of his soul, trembled, flickered. But the man's words resonated with a dark truth he couldn't deny. They had all been chosen. They had all been trapped in a cycle that couldn't be broken. And now it was too late. The man stepped forward again, closer, his presence now suffocating. "I've seen this place before. I've felt its pull, its hunger. It's not time that keeps it alive, you see. It's fear. It's the endless, gnawing need for something. To belong. You've all been feeding it." The keeper's consciousness flickered, grasping for meaning. What was the man saying? Feeding it? He had never thought of the shop as anything but a prison. But now the truth seemed to stretch before him, impossible to ignore. The cycles, the endless ticking, the transformations, they weren't just the mechanics of time. They were the shop's way of feeding, of sustaining itself. The figure in front of him smiled, a dark, knowing smile that sent a chill through the keeper's fading essence. "The shop doesn't need time to survive," the man continued. "It needs something else. It needs souls. It needs fear. It needs to control. And you, all of you, were part of the fuel that kept it going." The keeper tried to speak, but his form, what remained of him, had grown too weak. His thoughts were fragmented, like shattered glass, scattered and difficult to gather. The truth was there, just out of reach, but it was too much for him to grasp. His essence, once vibrant with the energy of the clocks, was now consumed with the oppressive weight of despair. "You can't escape," the man said softly, as if he were speaking to someone lost in a dream. "You never could, not until the cycle was truly broken. And that's what I've done. I've shattered all." The keeper's fading awareness flared again as the man's words registered. The cycle had been broken, but not just for the shop. It was broken for everything. Time itself had fractured, unraveling under the man's will. "Now, it's just us," the man continued, his voice almost soothing, as though he were trying to comfort the keeper. "The rest, they've all been absorbed, transformed. You'll never see them again. You'll never hear the ticking, the steady rhythm, because there is no time anymore. There's only this empty, hollow place where nothing can grow and nothing can die. The keeper felt a pang of loss, an almost physical ache as the last vestiges of time slipped away. The clocks had stopped, but now there was something far worse: emptiness. The absence of purpose, the absence of anything. It was the quietest kind of death, a slow, suffocating process that would stretch on for eternity, without the promise of release. "I'm sorry," the man whispered, almost tenderly, as though speaking to a child. "But the end is here, the end of the cycle, the end of time." With those final words, the man turned away, walking slowly toward the shattered remains of the clocks, his footsteps echoing like a distant drumbeat in the hollow silence. The keeper, now nothing but a whisper of thought, a wisp of awareness, could do nothing but watch as the man disappeared into the void. The shop, the once glorious prison, the endless cycle, was gone, swallowed by the quiet, the nothingness. There was no longer any sound, no ticking, no time. And in the absence of all things, the keeper was left alone with the most terrifying realization of all. There was no escape, no end, no beginning, only nothing. The cycle had been shattered, but in its wake, only emptiness remained. The keeper's presence, though faint, lingered in the stillness, a mere shadow of what he once had been. There was no longer any sound, no ticking, no movement. The shop, the clocks, the walls, everything was still suspended in a void of unrelenting silence. The emptiness was vast and oppressive, stretching infinitely in all directions. Time had ceased to exist, and with it, everything the keeper had known. For a moment, it felt as though he might fade entirely, consumed by the nothingness that surrounded him. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight distortion in the air, as if reality itself was bending, warping, trying to hold on to something. The keeper couldn't comprehend it fully. His mind, such as it was, felt fractured, slipping away. But there was movement now, far in the distance, something faint stirring in the periphery of his fractured awareness. Then a sound. The first sound in what felt like centuries. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It began as a murmur, a soft hum, but it grew, growing in strength and frequency until it became unmistakable. A tick, a single, solitary tick, and then another, a rhythmic beat, faint but persistent. The keeper's essence flickered in recognition. The cycle, was it returning? How? The clocks had been destroyed. Time had fractured. There had been nothing left. But still, the sound persisted, insistent, undeniable. The ticking once again began to fill the space. Slowly at first, then faster. The sound grew louder and louder, echoing across the vast nothingness. Each tick reverberated through the emptiness like a pulse. A heartbeat. The keeper felt it, felt the tug of it, deep within the hollow remnants of his being. The walls of the shop, the clocks that had once been shattered, began to reappear, slowly forming in the void. It was as if time itself were reassembling, stitching together the broken pieces of reality. The shop began to reform, its walls materializing from the fog of emptiness, the counters rising up from the nothingness, the shelves returning. The watches, once destroyed, were reforming, their glass faces bright and new. The ticks filled the air, swirling like a storm. The room began to shift, to rebuild. The keeper, though barely able to form coherent thought, could feel the change in the air. The cycle was returning, but this was different. As the shop reappeared, its structure reshaping, the air around the keeper began to hum with an unfamiliar energy. The light, though dim, flickered and fluctuated in an odd way. It wasn't quite the same as before. There was something off, something that didn't sit right. And it wasn't just the keeper, there was something in the very air that felt altered, unsettled. Then in the corner of the shop, the door opened. But this time, it wasn't like the others. It didn't creak with the usual monotony of repetition. It didn't announce the arrival of the next lost soul, the next keeper. This time, the door opened without the familiar sound of the hinges groaning, as though the very essence of the shop was being bent to something else. Something new, a figure stepped through. It wasn't the man who had shattered time. It wasn't the woman who had become one with the shop. This was something else. The figure was tall, shrouded in a dark cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its face was hidden, but its presence was undeniable. The keeper felt it immediately, the intensity of its being, the weight of its existence. It wasn't human. It wasn't like the others. The figure didn't move as the clocks continued their rapid ticking, their hands spinning erratically in all directions. It simply stood there, unmoving, as if surveying the broken fragments of the shop and the strange new reality it had found itself in. The air grew heavier, thick with an unnatural force. And then a voice, low, chilling, and impossibly old, filled the room. You thought you could break it. The voice was deep, resonating with a coldness that seemed to freeze the very space it touched. You thought you could end it, but you were wrong. Time is not a cycle. It is a prison, and it is unbreakable. The keeper's fading awareness flickered once more. The figure's words dug into what was left of him, scraping against the very edges of his consciousness. It felt as though the very foundation of the shop, of time, was being reinforced in a way he had never known. You were never meant to be free, the figure continued. No one ever is. A deep, reverberating hum echoed through the shop, vibrating through the keeper's very soul. The figure's presence radiated an ancient power, an overwhelming force that seemed to be pushing the keeper back into the very fabric of the shop, as if time itself were folding over him, absorbing him once more. No, the keeper's thoughts struggled to form. This isn't what it was before. The figure's hand moved upward, a slow, deliberate motion, and the ticking of the clock slowed. The entire shop seemed to breathe with the figure's movement, the walls shifting, compressing. The clocks, once scattered and disordered, began to line up again, resetting, organizing themselves. The timepieces that had shattered began to form themselves once more. The keeper could feel the pull, the inevitable gravitational force of the cycle, drawing him in. He fought against it, though his resistance was futile. His awareness flickered, and in that moment he saw it. The man who had shattered time, the one who had broken the cycle. His face flashed in the keeper's mind, a ghostly image of someone who had dared to undo the very thing that held them all captive. The keeper felt a bitter pang of realization. The man hadn't broken time. He had freed it. The figure in the cloak raised its hand fully now, and the shop, the prison, responded. The clocks clicked back into their places, all aligned, all synced. Time, as it had been, returned. But this was not the time of the keeper's past. This was something else, something that carried with it the dark weight of an ancient, unyielding force. You were never meant to escape, the figure murmured again, stepping closer to the keeper. Now, you are mine. The keeper's thoughts swirled, his mind growing dimmer and dimmer as the figure's words seared into his fading soul. The shop was no longer just a place of time. It was something darker, older, a place not for those who kept it, but for those who had been drawn in by its eternal hunger. And now, with the figure's final words, he understood. He was not the keeper. He was the kept. As time solidified around him once more, the keeper, now nothing more than a fragmented echo of his former self, was drawn into the fold of the cycle once again. But this time, he wasn't alone. The shop had been reborn, and it was hungry. The air in the shop had changed. No longer just a silent prison of ticking clocks. It now thrummed with a palpable, almost sentient energy. The figure in the dark cloak stood in the center of the room, its presence like an anchor in the storm of reality that seemed to twist and bend around it. The keeper, now fully submerged in the folds of this new reality, could feel his very essence being tugged toward the source of that energy, powerless to resist. Time, once broken and fractured, had mended itself, but it wasn't the same. It felt darker now, like an endless abyss. The clocks, once merely instruments to measure time, now seemed more like prisons, each one a cell that kept a piece of something imprisoned within it. Each tick was a weight. Each second was a chain. And the figure, this ancient being in the cloak, was not simply controlling the shop. It was the shop, You are not the first. The figure spoke again, its voice deep, resonating through the shop like a bell tolling. Nor will you be the last. There are many who have come before you, keepers, wanderers, lost souls. They too believe they could break free, believe they could undo what has always been. But it is futile. The keeper, now nothing but a faint echo of his former self, tried to hold on to his sense of self, tried to push back to understand. What had happened? Had the cycle truly been broken? Had the man who had once shattered time really freed them? Or had it all been part of a larger design? Was the shop a living thing? Was it feeding on their fear? Was that why it was always changing, always pulling them back? The figure in the cloak tilted its head, as if it could sense the keeper's thoughts, as if it had known the question even before it formed. You are weak, the figure said with a note of pity. Weak like all the others. You cannot understand because you have never truly known the nature of time. You believe it to be linear, to be a force that can be broken or destroyed. But you are mistaken. The keeper could feel the shop's pulse, rhythmic and unyielding. The ticking of the clocks was deafening now, the sound vibrating through his very being. He wanted to scream, to fight, but he was only a whisper of his former self, an echo trapped in a shell of something once alive. You are nothing without time, the figure continued. You were created by it, shaped by it, and you will return to it. You are nothing more than a tool, a part of the machine. The words crushed the keeper's already shattered mind. His thoughts swirled into disarray, each one colliding with the next in a maddening spiral. A tool, a part of the machine. How many times had he heard those words, spoken by the others who had come before him? And now he understood. He had been so focused on the idea of breaking free, on escaping the cycle. But the cycle had never been the prison. It was the keeper, he was the prison. Time itself had enslaved them all, not by keeping them within its bounds, but by using them to fuel its endless consumption. I had thought it was you who had broken the cycle. The keeper thought weakly, his voice a mere echo in the dark void. But was never broken, was it? It just shifted. You weren't trying to set me free. You were trying to replace me. The figure stepped closer, and the keeper could feel the overwhelming weight of its gaze, even though its face remained hidden beneath the hood. Yes, it whispered, its voice a low growl. I have been waiting for the right moment, the right soul to take its place. The cycle could never be broken, only transformed. And now you are mine. You will serve in ways you cannot comprehend. The keeper's fading essence recoiled at the thought. To serve again? To return to that existence where every movement was dictated by the ticking, where his every thought was warped by the incessant pull of clocks. His soul shuddered at the very notion. But as the figure reached out, the keeper felt a strange sensation, almost like the sting of a memory trying to resurface. The darkness around him seemed to flicker for a brief moment, as if the very air itself was shifting, a crack in the otherwise perfect abyss. What is that? The keeper thought, his consciousness struggling to focus, to pierce through the overwhelming fog of despair. A flicker, something hidden beneath the surface of a shop. Something familiar. The figure paused, its hand hovering in midair as it looked around the room, sensing the disturbance. The shop seemed to pulse in time with the ticking clocks, as though it were alive, aware. And then, for the briefest of moments, a crack appeared in the fabric of reality, a tear in the structure of the shop, a weak point. The keeper felt it, a fleeting sensation of power, of resistance. It was almost imperceptible, but there, the sensation of change, of something breaking through. For a second, the keeper dared to hope. Could it be? Could the cycle be altered once more? Could time itself be bent? The figure seemed to sense the shift as well. Its eyes, unseen but somehow present, narrowed, and it took a step back. You should not have awakened that, it said, its voice cold like ice cracking. The boundaries of this place are delicate. You cannot hope to break them again. The keeper, still tethered to the remnants of his own consciousness, clung to that fragile thread of hope. Maybe this time could be different. Maybe this time, the cycle could be broken, truly broken. But even as the thought formed, the shop began to change again, warping, bending under the figure's power. The clocks resumed their erratic ticking. The walls closed in, and the air became thick with the pressure of an unseen force. The sensation of change ebbed away, smothered by the overwhelming presence of the figure. "You will serve," the figure intoned, its voice as cold and final as a tomb. "And when you are done, when you have fulfilled your purpose, you will become part of the clockwork once more, a cog in the eternal machine." The keeper's consciousness began to fade, the once vibrant echo of his soul losing its form as it was drawn into the inevitable cycle. The ticking grew louder, impossibly louder, until it drowned out all thought. But somewhere, deep in the cracks of his fading mind, a question lingered, unanswered. Was there really no escape? Or had they simply been waiting for the right soul to break the rules? And with that final thought, the keeper was consumed once more by the unrelenting pulse of time, as the shop, and all that had been within it, fell into place once again. The cycle had resumed. The shop was alive once more, but not as it had been before. The ticking clocks, those once familiar sounds, now seemed almost foreign. Each tick felt heavy, filled with an unnatural weight, as though they were measuring something far darker than time. The walls, the shelves, the counter, everything settled into place as though it had never been broken. The figure in the dark cloak stood at the center of it all, its presence unyielding, as if the shop had grown into something even more sinister under its influence. The keeper, or what remained of him, could feel the pull of the cycle wrapping itself around him again, tightening like an iron fist around his soul. It was not just a physical force. It was as if his very essence had been reconfigured, reabsorbed into the ticking rhythm. His body, or what had been his body, no longer had the strength to resist. He felt himself drawn inexorably toward the familiar, dreaded position, the center of the shop, where the clocks ticked the loudest, where the timepieces pulsed with the energy of 1,000 lives that had come before. But there was something new, something different in the air now. The figures of those who had come before, the keepers who had served this strange, insatiable cycle, were absent. They were no longer trapped in the clockwork of time. Their presence, though invisible, had always been there, like shadows. But now, they were gone, vanished. Only the keeper remained. Only him. And yet, despite the oppressive darkness that surrounded him, a flicker of defiance remained. The faintest ember of resistance still burned in the depth of his fading consciousness. Had he truly failed? Had he truly become a part of the clockwork once again? The figure in the cloak took a slow, deliberate step forward, its steps echoing through the shop with a deep, unnerving resonance. It looked down at the keeper, its hidden gaze focused on him as though it could see the remnants of what he once was. "You still don't understand, do you?" the figure whispered, its voice resonating like an ancient incantation. "You are not merely a prisoner here. You are a vessel." The figure paused, its head tilting slightly, as if savoring the moment. "You always have been." The keeper felt the weight of those words pressing down on him like 1,000 stones. A vessel. He had never truly understood it before, had never seen the shop for what it was. The cycles of time weren't just endless, they were purposeful. They were part of something far larger, something older. The keeper had been a part of a system, a cog in the eternal machinery. And now, as the cycle folded over him once again, he realized that his role was not one of freedom or defiance, but of continuity. Without him, without those like him, the system would collapse. The clocks around him began to tick in perfect unison, the sound rising to a deafening crescendo. The air was thick with the pressure of time, twisting and shaping itself around the keeper, forcing him to bend to its will. "You are the key," the figure said softly, almost tenderly, as it raised its hand toward the keeper. "Without you, without your kind, this place would cease to exist. You are the glue that holds it all together. You are the keeper and the kept." A sudden, sharp pang of understanding pierced the keeper's fading consciousness. He had never been free. No one had. The shop, the clocks, the endless ticking, they were all designed to draw in those who could sustain it. Every keeper, Every lost soul had been drawn in and absorbed into the very fabric of the shop, forced to perpetuate the cycle, feeding it with their essence, their fear, their existence. And now it was his turn again. The figure's hand hovered just above the keeper's chest, and in that moment, the keeper could feel a strange energy coursing through him, a cold, suffocating force that seemed to drain him from the inside out. It was not physical, not at first. It was deeper, a consuming force, pulling at the very threads of his being, as though time itself was unraveling him, piece by piece. The keeper's consciousness fractured further, the last remnants of his resistance slipping away, overwhelmed by the figure's power. He could feel his essence being absorbed, his soul slowly folding into the vast clockwork of the shop. He wanted to scream, to fight, but there was nothing left. He was already fading into the very thing he had once tried to escape. But then, just as the darkness was about to consume him entirely, he heard it. A sound, the faintest of whispers, barely audible beneath the crashing tide of ticking. It was almost like a voice, an echo, a familiar voice. "It's not over." The words, though barely more than a thought, pierced the veil of the shop's overwhelming presence. The keeper's consciousness flickered, a fragile spark of awareness lighting up in the void. Was it real? Was there still hope? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The figure in the cloak paused, its hand still hovering above the keeper. It seemed to sense something, a shift, a disruption. Its form, though ever present, flickered for a brief moment, like a shadow struggling against the light. And in that moment of hesitation, the keeper felt it. A surge, a force, subtle but unmistakable, pushing back against the cycle. It was not his doing. It was not the figure's doing. It was something else, something outside the cycle. Time itself, it seemed, was bending again. The figure's voice broke the silence, sharp and filled with irritation. "You cannot escape it." It hissed, the calmness replaced by a rare edge of anger. "You have already given yourself to it. You are part of the machine, forever." But the keeper, now a mere fragment of what he had once been, felt it. The flicker, the disruption. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The shop once again began to shift. The ticking, the relentless beat of time began to falter. For the briefest of moments, it felt like time itself had hesitated, like the clocks had been thrown off their rhythm. And in that brief, fragile pause, the keeper understood something vital. There would always be a way. Time could be bent. It could be manipulated. It could be destroyed, but it could never be fully controlled. The shop, alive, hungry, eternal, might have been a prison, but it was also vulnerable. The cycle could be altered. It could break. And perhaps, for the first time, the keeper had become the key to its undoing. The figure turned away, sensing the subtle tremor in the air. But the keeper, his essence slowly piecing itself back together, had already made his decision. It was not over, and the cycle, for all its power, was not as unbreakable as they thought. The shop trembled as the keeper's fragile spark of resistance began to gain strength. The clocks, once synchronized in perfect harmony, now ticked out of sync, their rhythms jagged and erratic. The pulse of time, which had dominated the shop for so long, seemed to hesitate, as though it too was unsure of what was happening. A momentary stillness hung in the air, an unnatural silence. The figure in the dark cloak, its face still hidden beneath the folds of shadow, turned sharply. Its hooded gaze locked onto the keeper with an intensity that could have burned the very air between them. For the first time, there was uncertainty in its posture, a slight tremor in the way its cloak shifted. "You should not have done that," the figure said, its voice like the scraping of metal against stone. The words were cold, but there was an unmistakable edge of fear behind them. "You cannot break the rules. Time is not yours to play with." The keeper, though barely a whisper of his former self, felt a surge of something ancient and primal, an instinct he hadn't realized was still buried deep inside him. This was it, the moment when everything could either shatter or settle back into its suffocating rhythm. He had a choice, though it felt like an impossibly heavy one. If he gave in now, the cycle would restart, and he would become part of the machine once more. But if he resisted, if he truly fought back against the inevitable, he had no idea what would happen. The air around him grew thick with pressure, as though the very fabric of reality was straining to hold together. The shop seemed to breathe, its walls expanding and contracting like lungs in distress, struggling against an unseen force. The ticking grew louder, more erratic, now a chaotic symphony of dissonant beats. The keeper could feel it, a strange power tugging at him from the deepest reaches of his soul. The figure took a step forward, its shadow casting a long, suffocating streak across the floor. You are only delaying the inevitable. Time cannot be escaped. It cannot be undone, it said, its voice almost a whisper now. Everything has a place in this cycle. Even you. But the keeper, who had once been so consumed by the fear of the clocks, now felt an odd sense of clarity. The words of the figure, the overwhelming presence that had once defined his reality, were no longer as powerful. He understood now what had been hidden from him all along. Time was not a singular force, it was many things. It could be manipulated, twisted, altered, and it had a pattern, a rhythm, a pulse that could be disrupted. He drew in what remained of his strength and focused on the subtle disruption in the shop, the faint flicker of change. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He could feel the shifting energy within the very walls, like a pressure valve that was about to explode. Time had already been bent once. Maybe, just maybe it could be bent again. With the last remnants of his will, the keeper reached out, not physically, but mentally, spiritually, toward the heart of the shop. He didn't know how, but he felt it. The pulse of the clocks, the ebb and flow of the shop's power. He focused, willing himself into the rhythm, aligning himself with it. His mind reached out, seeking to grasp the pulse of time and shift it just enough to break its stranglehold. The figure in the cloak seemed to sense what was happening. It recoiled, taking a step back. No, it hissed, its voice rising in anger. The air around the keeper vibrated with an almost electric intensity. The ground beneath him shook as the walls of the shop seemed to groan in protest. You cannot fight time, the figure screamed, its voice warping, distorting, as if the very fabric of its existence was unraveling. The keeper's pulse quickened. It was working. He could feel it. His will, his determination, was beginning to make a difference. The once steady ticking of the clocks faltered, skipping and stuttering. The walls of the shop seemed to ripple as though reality itself was stretching, cracking under the pressure. For the briefest of moments, the figure seemed almost human, its shape flickering in and out of clarity. It was no longer certain. It was no longer invincible. The keeper could feel the cycle beginning to fracture. "You don't understand," the figure cried out, its voice no longer cold but desperate, pleading. "Time will consume you, just like it consumes everything. It will unravel you, break you into 1,000 pieces. You cannot fight it. You will lose. I will make sure of it." The shop began to implode, the clocks ringing out in dissonant chimes, their hands spinning in chaotic directions. The air turned thick, suffocating, as the walls began to pulse with an eerie, rhythmic energy. It was as though the entire shop was alive, its very foundation groaning under the strain. But the keeper's resolve hardened. He would not be undone. He could feel it now. Something greater than the shop, something beyond the figure's power, something free from the grasp of time. It was a force older than the clocks, a force that had been here long before the shop, and would remain long after it. And in that moment, something snapped. The ground beneath the keeper's feet shattered, the very structure of the shop cracking wide open. Time splintered. The clocks that had once ticked in unison shattered, their glass faces imploding into a cascade of shattered shards. The walls of the shop twisted and warped, the once imposing darkness now breaking into fragmented beams of light. The keeper's essence, his soul, seemed to stretch and ripple like a fabric pulled in every direction. He felt himself disintegrating, but not in the way the figure had promised. He wasn't being consumed. He was transforming, becoming something else, The figure screeched, its form splintering and breaking apart, its cloak falling to the ground in tatters. The once immense power that had controlled the shop began to fade, its hold weakening as the keepers bled into the cracks in time. The figure's voice, once so filled with certainty, was now barely a whisper as its form crumbled away. And then, as the very fabric of the shop unraveled, a final echo lingered in the air, a voice, faint and far away, but unmistakable. "You have freed us all." The keeper, now nothing more than a fleeting thought, a momentary ripple in the fractured tapestry of time, smiled. The cycle had ended. Time, in all its eternal grasp, had been defeated. For now, the shop, once a labyrinth of endless ticking and oppressive darkness, had fallen silent. The fragments of clocks, the shattered pieces of reality, hung suspended in the air like frozen shards of a broken mirror. The walls that had once imprisoned everything now appeared to be dissolving, fading into nothingness. The ticking had ceased, and with it, the weight of time that had long burdened every corner of the space. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no motion, just an empty, vast stillness where the shop had once been. The keeper, now little more than a whisper of thought and flickering consciousness, found himself suspended in the vast void. His essence drifted, weightless, as if caught between the realms of existence and non-existence. The figure, the dark, cloaked entity that had once controlled the shop, was gone. Its power had dissipated with the shattering of time. But as the keeper's fading consciousness began to stretch and shift, a question lingered at the edges of his mind. Had he truly won? He could feel something. Something still pulsed beneath the surface of the void. A faint echo, like the ripple of stone dropped into a still pond. It was not the figure's power. It was something else. Something beyond even the clocks, beyond the confines of the shop. He reached out, his essence expanding into the silence. The world around him began to slowly reform, but it was not the same. It was not the shop. Not anymore. The cracks in the fabric of time had opened something new, something unseen. A glimmer of light pierced through the void, and as it did, a voice, distant, yet somehow familiar, echoed through the empty space. "You have awakened the path." The keeper's thoughts froze. The path? What path? He strained to focus, trying to grasp the meaning behind the words, but it was difficult. The sensation of being stretched too thin, of existing in many places at once, made it hard to concentrate. Then, the light grew brighter, swirling like a vortex, drawing him in. He could feel it, a pull, almost like gravity, but not of the physical world. It was deeper. He felt himself drawn toward it, against his will, compelled by something older than time itself. "You have set things in motion," the voice continued, clearer now, though still distant. "But the cycle cannot truly be broken. It can only change. And change comes with consequences." As the keeper drifted closer to the light, the voice grew more distinct, but not just a voice, a presence. He could feel it, this force, this being ancient, infinite. And then, from within the light, something emerged, a figure. It was not cloaked in shadow, like the one who had once controlled the shop. This figure was radiant, its form shifting like liquid light, its face impossibly ethereal. "You," the keeper whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Who are you?" The radiant figure stepped forward, its form shifting and swirling like a nebula caught in a storm. "I am what lies beyond the cycles. What you have released, what you have awakened, is a path between worlds. Time is not merely a loop to be escaped. It is an endless river, flowing through all that has been and all that will be." The keeper's mind raced. He had only ever seen time as something to be defeated, something to break free from. But this being, this force, was speaking of something much larger, something beyond his understanding. "You did not destroy time," the figure continued, its voice gentle yet powerful. "You only shifted it, and in doing so, you have opened a door, a path that had been sealed for eons." The keeper felt the weight of those words press into his mind, as if they were unraveling the very understanding he had held about his existence. A door? A path? Had he truly just made things worse? Had he merely opened a door to something even more dangerous than the shop had ever been? "You are not the first," the figure said, its glowing presence flickering as though it, too, was not entirely certain of the implications of what had just happened. "But you are the one who has made the choice. And now, there is no turning back." The keeper tried to speak, to ask what had happened to the shop, to the clocks, to the cycles. But no words formed. His essence was not bound to a voice anymore. It was no longer a thing of flesh or material thought. He could only feel the enormous shift in the fabric of reality around him. "All who have come before you have walked in the shadows of time," the radiant figure continued, its voice now infused with an undertone of sorrow. "They were contained, but you have broken that containment. You have made the cycles aware. You have made them real." The keeper felt the enormity of what he had done. He had never fully understood the price of breaking the cycle. The cycles weren't just time. They were the very threads that held everything together. And now, those threads were fraying, unraveling. The figure paused, looking at him with an infinite depth of ancient knowledge. "You must walk the path now. The door has opened, but it is not one that can be easily crossed. Once you step beyond, there is no return. You will become something else." The keeper felt a cold shiver run through what remained of his essence. A part of him wanted to resist, to push away this strange being and the path it spoke of. But the force drawing him forward, the pull of the door, was undeniable. He had already shifted the fabric of time. He had already altered the course of reality. And now, there was only one choice left. "You have chosen," the radiant figure intoned, its voice fading, like the last breath of an ancient storm. "You are the bridge now, the keeper and the wanderer. You must walk the path where time no longer has a hold." And then, as the light expanded and consumed the keeper, the void cracked open entirely. The keeper felt himself falling, no longer bound by time, no longer confined to the shop. He was drifting, slipping through the cracks of reality, through a space where time held no dominion. As the last echoes of the shop faded into nothingness, the keeper realized something impossible. The path was not to escape time, but to become something greater, something unbound. And as he disappeared into the endless horizon of the unknown, one final thought remained in his fading consciousness. This was only the beginning. Time, it seemed, was no longer something to be feared. It was something to be traversed. The keeper, now lost in the void, felt a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. No longer tethered to the shop or the oppressive ticking that had defined his existence, he floated freely, suspended in a limitless space. Time no longer had meaning here. There was no past, no future, only an eternal now. The world around him, if it could be called a world, was neither dark nor light, but something in between. The edges of reality seemed to bend, swirling like a nebula, ever shifting and incomprehensible. There were no walls, no boundaries, only an endless stretch of possibilities. He felt like a particle adrift in a vast ocean of unknowns, uncertain of where he was headed or whether there was any destination at all. And yet, despite the overwhelming uncertainty, a strange sense of calm washed over him. He was no longer burdened by the weight of time, nor by the relentless cycles that had once consumed him. He was free, or so it seemed. But as he drifted deeper into this place beyond time, the keeper began to feel an unsettling presence, as if something or someone was watching him. A flicker in the distance, like the glimmer of a distant star, caught his attention. It wasn't just a random speck of light. It pulsed with a strange, familiar energy, a kind of resonance like a heartbeat in the void. He focused, his essence drawn toward it, instinctively understanding that it was not a random anomaly. It was calling him. He didn't know how, but he knew. He had to go to it. As he approached, the flickering grew clearer, more defined. He could feel the pull growing stronger, the sensation of being drawn towards something important. The figure, radiant, ethereal, otherworldly, reappeared, but it was no longer distant. This time, it was directly before him, its presence emanating a sense of both ancient wisdom and chilling authority. "You've come," the figure spoke, its voice reverberating in the air, vibrating through the space like a chorus of forgotten voices. "And you understand now, don't you? Time is not the enemy. It is a cycle, a river of existence that must flow." The keeper wanted to speak, to ask what he had been brought here to understand. But his form, his essence, had no voice. He could only feel, only sense. The radiant figure continued, unbothered by the keeper's silence. "You sought to break the cycle, to defy the inevitability of time. But in doing so, you've opened a new door, one that cannot be closed. You've walked beyond the constraints of time itself, and now you must walk the path that lies ahead." The keeper's essence trembled at the figure's words. The path? He had hoped to escape time, to leave the endless ticking and the suffocating repetition behind. But now, it seemed, he had only traded one prison for another. The figure's glow flickered, its form shifting like molten light. "You have become something else now," it intoned. "Not bound to the cycles of time, not trapped in the endless loop. But you are no longer merely human." The figure's tone deepened, as if weighing the gravity of its words. "You are a wanderer now, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of what lies beyond." Beyond what? The thought appeared in the keeper's consciousness, as if asking the question aloud, though no sound was made. "What am I meant to do now?" The figure paused, as if considering the answer. "The path you've chosen is not an easy one," it said, its voice now carrying a note of solemnity. "You must guide the lost, the ones who have been trapped in the cycles, the ones who wander in the shadows of time, seeking meaning. You are the one who can lead them across the threshold, across the divide between the worlds of time and the endless possibilities that lie beyond it." The keeper's consciousness fluttered, unsure of what this truly meant. He had never asked to be a guide. He had never wanted to be anything more than a simple keeper, an unwilling participant in the cycle. But now, it seemed, he had been thrust into something far grander. He had become a being untethered to time itself, a force capable of altering the course of destiny. "Your task will not be easy," the figure warned. "There will be those who resist. There will be forces, ancient and powerful, who will try to stop you. But remember this. In the end, time itself is a fragile thing. It can be bent, it can be altered, but it can also be undone." The keeper felt a ripple of uncertainty surge through him. Undone. The thought was almost incomprehensible. Could time itself truly be undone? What did that mean for everything that had ever existed? The radiant figure seemed to sense his confusion and answered, its voice softer now, almost like a lullaby. "There are those who would try to trap time once more, to restore the cycle. But you are the key. You can guide the lost souls, help them transcend, or you can destroy the very system that binds them. The choice, as always, is yours." The keeper felt a weight settle over him, as though the full magnitude of the task before him was finally dawning. He was no longer just a prisoner of time, nor was he simply a lost soul wandering the empty corridors of the shop. He had become something far more dangerous, far more powerful. He could now shift the world, could break the fabric of time if he so chose. But the consequences of such an act, he shuddered to think of them. "You are no longer alone," the figure continued. "There are others who have walked this path before you. You will meet them when the time is right. Together, you will decide the fate of time itself." The keeper, still unable to speak but feeling the weight of these words deep in his essence, understood the gravity of what had happened. His journey, it seemed, had only just begun. The radiant figure, seeing the keeper's awareness taking shape, gave one final piece of advice. "Remember, you're not a keeper of clocks anymore. You are a keeper of the future, a wanderer between worlds." And with that, the figure began to fade, its light dimming slowly until it was nothing more than a whisper in the vastness. But the keeper was no longer lost. He could feel the path opening before him, an endless horizon stretching into eternity. The path was his to walk, and it was one that would stretch beyond time itself. And as the keeper began to move forward, The void around him began to take shape, a new world, one that had never existed before. It was a world without the constraints of time, without the ticking clocks, but filled with new mysteries, new choices, and new consequences. The Keeper felt a deep sense of resolve. His journey had only just begun, and the future, whatever it held, was his to shape. The Keeper felt the endless void around him begin to solidify, as if the very fabric of existence itself was pulling together, drawing in the scattered fragments of reality. Time, in its traditional sense, was gone, replaced by something altogether different. The once oppressive ticking, the unyielding pulse of the clocks, had faded, leaving behind only an eerie silence, punctuated by the distant echo of things yet to come. The world before him began to take form, though it was not a world as he knew it. It wasn't bound by laws of time, nor was it tethered to the past. It was like a canvas waiting to be painted, and the Keeper realized, with a deep, unsettling clarity, that he was the one who would shape it. Every step he took, every thought that passed through his consciousness, wove the very threads of this new existence. He moved forward, uncertain but resolute. What had begun as a journey to escape the endless cycle of time had now transformed into something far greater. He was not merely walking through a void anymore. He was walking through the heart of creation itself, where the rules of reality were still being written. This was a place where everything could be remade, twisted, or shattered at will. The path before him twisted and turned, winding through a landscape that seemed to fluctuate in a constant state of flux. Some places looked like shattered fragments of the world he had left behind. Broken clocks, crumbling cities, barren wastelands where time had long since died. Others were strange and alien. Floating islands suspended in the sky, full of swirling, multicolored nebulae, or vast oceans of light that stretched endlessly in all directions, reflecting the chaotic dance of possibility. But amid the chaos, there were also signs of something more ordered, more structured. The faint outline of cities in the distance, their lights flickering like stars, and pathways that twisted and converged into distinct roads. The world, though strange, was not entirely formless. It was shaping itself. "You are here." A voice echoed suddenly, low and melodic, resonating through the space. The Keeper stopped in his tracks, his essence instinctively reaching out to the voice, sensing that it was neither human nor familiar, but deeply intertwined with the forces that governed this new realm. From the swirling mist ahead, a figure emerged, an indistinct silhouette, barely tangible, like smoke weaving through the air. As it stepped forward, the Keeper could sense its presence, a strange pull, like gravity, drawing him closer, while simultaneously filling him with an indescribable sense of awe. "You have crossed the threshold," the figure said, its voice blending with the sounds of the universe itself, as if every word was woven from the very fabric of existence. "You are not alone here. This place is not without its guides, its keepers." The figure's shape flickered, momentarily sharpening into something more defined. The Keeper saw it, an ethereal being, its form glowing softly, resembling a combination of light and shadow. The eyes, if they could be called that, were like deep wells of knowledge, endless and infinite. "Who are you?" the Keeper asked, though he knew there was no need for words. The question hung in the air, more of a thought than a spoken inquiry. The figure smiled, though it was not a smile of comfort. It was a smile that hinted at the unknown, at the vast mysteries of the universe, stretching far beyond time, beyond even the Keeper's understanding. "I am one who has walked this path before you, and I will walk it with you still. I have been here long before the cycles of time began, and will remain long after they have faded. I am a guide, just as you now are, though your path has only begun." The Keeper felt an unfamiliar sensation, a tug at the core of his essence, as if something inside him was awakening. He had been thrust into this new reality, this new existence, and now he was no longer just the Keeper of clocks, nor the lost soul who had wandered through the endless cycles. He was something greater, something that could transcend the boundaries of time itself. The question that lingered was whether he was ready to embrace it. Why am I here? The question came again, not from his lips, but from the depths of his being. What is my purpose in this place? The guide's figure shifted, as if considering the gravity of the question. Your purpose is to shape this world, it said, its voice filling the air with resonance. To lead those who come after you, those who were once lost in the cycles of time. You are a creator and a guide, the keeper of the future. The keeper felt the weight of the guide's words settle deep within him. He was a creator now? Yes, but a creator without limits. He could shape this realm, mold it, make it anything he wished. But with this power came responsibility. Could he bear the weight of such an unimaginable task? Time has always been a cycle, the guide continued. But you have broken it. You have opened the door to something more. And in doing so, you have freed not just yourself, but everyone who had been lost to the unending loops of time. They will come here, to this place, searching for guidance. Some will seek meaning, others answers, and some redemption. The keeper's mind raced. The consequences of his actions were far more profound than he had ever imagined. By breaking the cycle of time, he hadn't just freed himself. He had freed countless others who had been trapped within the confines of the world he had once known. He was now responsible for their futures. And what happens to those who do not wish to be freed? The keeper asked, his voice uncertain but determined. What if some resist this change? What if they want to return to the cycles? The figure before him seemed to pause, as though considering this possibility. There will always be those who resist change, it said slowly, as if weighing each word. Some will cling to the old ways, to the comfort of the familiar. But you will be the one who shows them the truth, that the cycles, though once necessary, are not the only way. Some will accept this new existence, while others may choose to walk away. The keeper felt a shiver of uncertainty ripple through him. What if he couldn't lead them? What if he failed? What if the very foundation of this new world he was creating began to crack under the weight of those who resisted? You will not be alone, the guide whispered, almost as if reading his thoughts. You will meet others along the way. They will help you, just as you will help them. Together, you will forge a path forward. A path where time is no longer an unbreakable chain, but a river that flows freely. The keeper took a deep, steadying breath. He understood now. His journey had not ended with the destruction of the shop or the breaking of time. It had only just begun. The world he was now in, this place beyond the cycles, was one of endless potential, a world where anything was possible, and yet everything was at stake. He was the keeper of this new realm, the wanderer between worlds, the one who would shape the future of all who had been lost to time. And so, with his resolve hardened and his path set before him, the keeper took his first step forward into the unknown. The future, both terrifying and beautiful, awaited him. The keeper took his first step into the endless expanse that stretched before him, the landscape unfolding like the pages of an unwritten story. The guide, ever present but distant, stood watching from the periphery, its gaze a steady force that anchored the keeper to the uncertain path ahead. The weight of responsibility felt both exhilarating and suffocating. It was no longer just about escaping the cycle of time, about breaking free from the ticking of clocks. It was about shaping a reality, one that would sustain or shatter all that came after. Every step he took in this vast world felt like a choice that could send ripples through the fabric of this reality. He was both creator and participant, the author and the reader, forever caught between worlds. The keeper realized in this moment that there was no final destination. The world itself was in a constant state of becoming, just as he was. There would never be an end, only choices, and the consequences of those choices. As he walked, the world around him began to shift, as if responding to his very presence. Some paths ahead glimmered with possibility, while others faded into darkness, like roads forgotten and abandoned. But through it all, the keeper could sense the arrival of others, souls lost in time, just as he had once been. They wandered in and out of his vision, glimpses of faces twisted by confusion, fear, and a yearning for something they could not name. He reached out, feeling the edges of their essences drawing them closer. Some came willingly, following the call of the path. Others resisted, lingering in the shadows, unsure of what awaited them. A group of figures emerged from the mist, their forms flickering like fragile candle flames. They were the lost, the souls who had been trapped in the cycles of time, waiting for someone to show them the way out. The keeper paused, his heart heavy with the weight of his new role. He had to guide them. He had to offer them the same chance at freedom he had been given. "Come," he called softly, his voice carrying the resonance of something beyond time itself. There is a new world waiting, a world where time is no longer a prison. The figures hesitated, their faces uncertain. Some appeared hopeful, while others were reluctant, as if the idea of change terrified them. The keeper stepped forward, extending his essence, drawing them toward him with an invisible pull. "You are no longer bound by the cycles," he repeated, more firmly this time. "The time you knew is gone. Here, you can walk freely. The path is yours to choose." One by one, they stepped forward until the group stood before him, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and awe. They were lost no more, as the keeper led them forward, guiding them through the strange, shifting landscape. He felt the weight of their expectations. They were looking to him, not just as a guide, but as a symbol of something greater, something beyond the limitations of time. They sought answers, meaning, and purpose in this new world. And though the keeper felt the burden of their gaze, he also understood that he could not offer them the answers they sought. He could only show them the path. "You will find your own way," he said softly, as the first of the travelers ventured into the unknown. "You must walk it, step by step, until you know who you are in this place. Time no longer defines you, but your choices do." And so, the keeper and his group wandered further into the shifting realm, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Each one of them would have to confront their own fears, their own desires, and their own purpose in this world beyond time. The keeper knew that some would falter, some would turn away, and others would find what they sought. But for the first time, he understood that he could not control their destinies. They were free to choose their own paths. The world around them continued to evolve, each new step carving out new possibilities. In the distance, the keeper could see new horizons emerging, cities of light and shadow, vast forests of forgotten memories, oceans of liquid time, where the waves would carry them to places unknown. The world was a canvas, and each soul was a brushstroke in the masterpiece of existence. As they moved forward, the keeper knew his role was not to dictate the future, but to watch over it, to ensure that the cycle would not repeat itself, to help those who had been lost in time find their way, just as he had. And perhaps, just perhaps, he could create a place where time was no longer a force to be feared, but a river that could be navigated, bent, and understood. With that thought, the keeper allowed himself to feel a deep sense of peace. The path before him was not one of endings, but of endless beginnings. He was no longer bound to the past, to the clockwork world he had once known. He had transcended time, and in doing so, had become something greater, something eternal. The world stretched out before him, vast and infinite, and for the first time, he felt truly free. There was no need for an end. There was only the journey that would never truly cease. The keeper took one last step into the unknown, knowing that whatever came next would shape the future for all of them. And so, the story ended. But it was not the end. It was only the beginning.